In 2016, 22-year-old Julia Enright was studying at the Massachusetts Medical College in the USA. At that time, she met a young man named Brandon Chicklese, who was 18. Brandon was a technology student, fulfilling his dream of becoming a heating and ventilation technician. Julia and Brandon were completely different from each other. Julia dressed and behaved as differently as possible, whereas Brandon dressed modestly and was kind and calm. Brandon grew up surrounded and cared for by his parents. He had been a Boy Scout for over 10 years, was described by those who knew him well as responsive and open. When he and Julia started dating, their union seemed like a real attraction of opposites. Gradually, they began an intimate relationship, and Julia involved Brandon in unusual forms of intimacy. Given their age, it was not easy to find privacy for such experiments, so Julia suggested using a treehouse owned by one of her friends. The house was abandoned and located in a wooded area just a few kilometers away from the suburban homes where Julia was born and raised. Over time, the owner stopped visiting the secluded place, and Julia began to use the house freely. She decorated her improvised shelter with chains and other paraphernalia, turning it into a base for their experiments. Her collection of unique objects began to form there. By the time Brandon first visited this place, an eerie atmosphere pervaded it, inspiring dark thoughts. However, he tolerated the oddities of his girlfriend, and they regularly met there. But as their relationship developed, Brandon increasingly felt that they were not right for each other. Eventually, he realized that further development of their relationship was impossible. Brandon suggested breaking up and remaining friends. Julia agreed. It seemed that both of them calmly separated, demonstrating emotional maturity. In 2018, Brandon lived with his parents in the small town of Rindge, New Hampshire. He had obtained the qualification for which he had studied and worked so long, becoming a heating engineer. He started dating another girl and was preparing to celebrate his birthday in July. It seemed that, despite his young age, he had managed to achieve something significant. He had an education, a stable job, and a relationship with a girl. He sincerely told his family that he felt happier than ever. Shortly before this period, Brandon thought he had gained the necessary experience and was ready to open his own business in heating systems. He began to take action, and everyone gave him great support for this initiative. Relatives, friends, and his girlfriend all recognized that Brandon was just the type of person who could successfully run his own business. Unfortunately, it was not destined for him to realize these dreams. On June 23, 2018, Brandon left home to visit relatives in Windham, New Hampshire. For this, he had to travel about 80 kilometers, just over an hour's journey. He left home at around 1 p.m., but he did not return to his relatives by evening. Any attempts to contact him were ignored. His family, girlfriend, and grandmother were understandably panicking. This behavior was completely uncharacteristic of Brandon. His mobile phone was turned off, a situation he had never experienced before, as he had a busy schedule and could receive calls from new clients at any moment. Unfortunately, in order to contact the authorities to report a missing person, they had to wait at least a day. On the morning of June 24th, Brandon's parents went to the police station. They presented their arguments in detail and were very worried because Brandon was not prone to spontaneous parties or meetings with friends, did not suffer from any mental problems. Generally should not have disappeared anywhere. Law enforcement began to search for traces of Brandon in Windham. However, despite their efforts, they could find no evidence that he had even reached the city. There were no traces of his car, including on recordings from CCTV cameras. Brandon did not buy anything in Windham, did not pay for gas with his card, and did not use his phone. In this state of having no leads, 5 days passed. Family members searched for him, but increasingly, the thought that they would not see their loved one again haunted them. Finally, on June 29th, a gray Honda Civic was found in the parking lot of the Hannaford supermarket on Route 202 in Rindge, New Hampshire. It was Brandon's car. It was unclear how the car appeared there, especially since it was unlocked and the keys were left in the ignition. This only strengthened the suspicion that something terrible had occurred. Brandon would never have treated his property this way. Such methods are often used by criminals to provoke the theft of a vehicle, leaving fingerprints behind to set up innocent people. During this time, relatives continued their search, distributing, pasting flyers throughout Brandon's hometown and the surrounding area. Unfortunately, all these efforts were in vain. On July 10, 2018, a random runner training in a forested area in Ringe made a horrifying discovery just 10 kilometers from the shopping center where Brandon's car was found. He located a human body, which was hidden in the bushes only tens of meters from the side of the highway. The remains of the young man were wrapped in tarpaulin, and his hands and feet were bound with tape. Given the condition of the body at the time of discovery, most of the flesh had rotted away, exposing the bones. When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene, they immediately stated that this method of hiding the body was not chosen by chance. In fact, such extensive decomposition is an extremely effective way to get rid of evidence in the shortest possible time. Autopsy results showed the victim was Brandon Chiklis. It was believed that the detectives were dealing with a fairly experienced killer who knew how to evade justice. The perpetrator probably carefully studied related materials, and perhaps this was not his first crime. Suspicion only increased when investigators managed to find the shirt that Brandon had been wearing. It had several distinct cuts, apparently from a knife. Judging by this item of clothing, the victim had been stabbed 12 times. Unfortunately, the forensic expert could not confirm all of these wounds due to the body's condition. Perhaps they were more due to the high degree of decomposition. Thus, the expert could only speak with certainty about the traces left on the bones. For the same reason, it was not possible to establish the exact cause of death. It was possible that Brandon was tortured, but proving or disproving such guesses turned out to be impossible. No matter how hard the investigators tried, they were unable to find his mobile phone. It was apparently destroyed or discarded. Since the moment of Brandon's disappearance, they could not connect to his means of communication. This only confirmed the idea that the crime was committed by an experienced killer who knew that any information carriers and means of communication were compromising. This strategy was effective, as the police could not even establish the route Brandon had taken before his death or after the murder. Fortunately, the detectives still had access to the list of calls from Brandon's mobile phone before it was turned off. When they received this information from the operator, they discovered that the last call before his disappearance and the switching off of his mobile phone was made near the home of his ex-girlfriend, Julia. Investigators assumed he could have visited her before leaving. As soon as the patrol officers arrived near Julia's house, they immediately suspected something was wrong. There was an unbearable smell of rotting flesh. Even more shocking discoveries awaited within the house. Officers found decomposing bodies of animals literally everywhere in the rooms. Outside, they were wrapped in tarpaulin, and inside, in various containers, there were BDSM kits, specific paraphernalia, knives, and related photos. In fact, this house became the most horrifying location in the memory of all the participants of the first encounter with Julia. Julia lived alone in her father's house. She worked as a phlebotomist in a clinical laboratory, dealing with blood, collecting it for analysis, and preparing samples. Given the respect that doctors receive in the USA, it was a rather esteemed profession. Julia was always a peculiar person. As it turned out, these quirks went far beyond the bounds of normalcy. Her work was not just a way for her to help people and earn a living, it became something much more. During the day, she worked as a phlebotomist, but at night, she turned into another person. She became quite famous in the escort industry, acting as a mistress. Her friends and acquaintances knew of Julia's BDSM fetish, which she openly discussed. She claimed that only willing participants were involved in her activities, insisting that it was a form of entertainment and that all clients left satisfied. However, none of her acquaintances suspected the dangers involved. Despite her fears and risks, she decided to take a big step, even posting an ad on a specialized website inviting everyone to engage in play involving knives and blood. According to the description, it was supposed to be BDSM domination, which involved lightly injuring the client and allowing them to bleed. This was a specific category of entertainment. There would always be clients willing to participate. Moreover, no one should care about what happens in someone else's bed if it is done by mutual consent. However, such activities always suspiciously resemble a front to cover up darker deeds or even a trap for naive partners. As it turned out, Julia had her own skeletons in the closet. She didn't just associate her life with blood, it was more akin to an obsession. In fact, she had a fascination not only with blood but also with dead flesh. She had a real collection of dead animals displayed in jars, among them large specimens like ravens. Additionally, almost constantly in her courtyard lay decomposing animal bodies, which she wrapped in tarpaulin to speed up decomposition from the heat and then used their bones for her artistic compositions. Despite the nightmarish aspects and especially the terrible smell, Julia perceived some sort of beauty in this and embodied it through her art. Unfortunately, her vision of beauty proved too perverse and cruel to earn her a place among artists. Moreover, Julia had a whole collection of vials filled with blood and used condoms. She was obsessed with serial killers. She once even described a kind of ritual in which she personally participated. When a whole group of people gathered, they acted out scenes with vampires and actually drank some of each other's blood. Despite these suspicious hobbies, Julia had friends and willingly demonstrated her creativity. She always claimed that she had no talent in art, but in this way, she expressed her vision of the world. In fact, time and time again, Julia showed her friends the remains of animals, which were laid out in specific patterns. Of course, most people were concerned about where she got all these bodies. To such questions, Julia always answered briefly that everything necessary for this so-called art was found in a forest or on the side of the road. Julia insisted that she did not harm living beings but found and used the bodies of dead animals. Considering that in everyday life she was very quiet and avoided conflicts, people believed that this was just an oddity. Apparently, Julia's inner circle didn't know about Jeffrey Dahmer. This infamous man once started with a similar fixation. He also collected dead animals and became obsessed with the study of remains. He described his passion as an alternative vision of the world or creativity. Like Julia, Dahmer surrounded himself with things of a frankly creepy nature, and naturally, this could not end well. Julia kept a detailed diary in which she described her life and her activities exploring her own psyche. It seemed she was not fully aware that her hobbies looked strange and provocative. She continued to view them as creative pursuits and spoke somewhat arrogantly about people who did not understand art and beauty. However, there were less philosophical notes in the diary. She described bloodthirstiness as a charming character trait and revealed her unhealthy attitude toward death. From the very first entry, she constantly talked about her obsessive desire to kill a person. Julia considered it the height of bloodthirstiness, a manifestation of insatiability, which excited and attracted her. Julia repeatedly mentioned that she was driven to this monstrous act by a certain hunger that arose with every thought of killing a person. All this frightening data was obtained during the investigation. The longer the police dug to understand who Julia was, the more shocked they became. For the detectives, it became obvious that they had encountered a potential serial killer. The biggest source of incriminating data was her mobile phone, which was taken for examination. As it turned out, shortly before Brandon's disappearance, Julia had met a new boyfriend named Jonathan Lind. They were both rather dark personalities, making them perfectly suited for each other. The night before Brandon's disappearance, immediately after the incident, Julia sent Jonathan a message containing the alarming phrase, "bloodbath." Detectives immediately noted that the treatment of Brandon's body was identical to the method Julia had used to accelerate the decomposition of animal remains. Even more unusual was the message sent to Brandon the day before his disappearance, in which Julia asked if he would come to visit her treehouse. The investigation established that a few weeks before her death, Julia was actively trying to improve her relationship with her ex since there were difficulties with the current girlfriend of Brandon. In fact, they were on the verge of breaking up due to her betrayal. Probably as a result of this, Julia managed to draw him in. In the end, he agreed to meet her at a kind of BDSM club, perhaps thinking of this visit to his ex as an act of reconciliation. Immediately after Brandon agreed to Julia's invitation, she wrote to her new boyfriend Jonathan that there was a surprise for him. By communicating with the neighbors of Julia, the police easily uncovered details of her intimate relationships and preferences. She openly shared this information with the entire neighborhood and seemed to even speak with pride about her activities in the intimate sphere. Gradually, the detectives came into possession of a business card on which she suggested playing with a knife and blood. There were witnesses who testified that Julia and her new boyfriend liked to cut each other during intimate. However, she herself would discuss it openly without the slightest embarrassment. When she ended up at the station for questioning, she laid out all the details. Surprisingly, after this conversation with Julia, the police officers let her go. She managed to convince them that despite her oddities, she was not involved in the murders and that there was no concrete evidence against her. According to Julia's confession, she truly intended to meet Brandon on that fateful day, but he never showed up. She sent him a message in the evening, but the guy never responded. Finally, one of the police officers decided to verify the information and found other messages from Brandon that Julia had not mentioned. Those messages made it clear that the former lovers had indeed met. This fleeting lie raised suspicions that the detectives had encountered a manipulative individual who needed to be further investigated. These guesses turned out to be correct. The more the police talked to Julia, the more she changed her story. Eventually, she admitted that she did meet with Brandon that evening. According to her, after a short conversation, he left to buy banned substances for the night, but the guy never returned and did not answer her calls, so she just went home. This also turned out to be a lie, as the guy did not use banned substances. After the lie was revealed, the detective spoke to the neighbors of Julia again, and they found out about the treehouse in the woods that Julia had turned into a BDSM headquarters. The officers focused on finding this hideout and managed to arrive there with her new boyfriend. It was obvious that the house had been thoroughly cleaned. There was even new furniture and a new carpet. Everything looked suspicious, as if someone had tried to cover up evidence of a crime. The carpet attracted the most attention. It looked out of place in this treehouse, as did the cleanliness, especially in sharp contrast to the chains and jars of blood and animal bodies. As soon as the carpet was lifted, it became evident that it was covering very large, washed-out blood stains. Similar traces were found under the floorboards. Blood also was on the steps and tree trunks. They had obviously tried to wash it off, but in vain, so they simply covered it with a carpet. It resembled a bloodbath. Judging by the number and size of these marks, it was clear that they were related to a deceased victim. Julia insisted that all these traces belonged to dead animals she had collected on the street. After searching the car, blood was also found there. Julia denied that Brandon was ever in the car or that they met in the treehouse on the day of the disappearance. However, DNA testing showed that she was lying, as most of the traces belonged to Brandon. As soon as the detectives presented this evidence, she changed her story again. Julia claimed that after her meeting with Brandon, they got very drunk. He went to get banned substances, and then they met in the treehouse. According to her confession, her ex-boyfriend attacked her, demanding intimate, but Julia resisted, justifying herself by saying that she had a new boyfriend. However, this did not help, as Brandon attacked and tried to abuse her. According to her, at that moment, she had no choice. Julia managed to reach for a knife, which she always carried on her belt. She claimed to have stabbed Brandon several times in self-defense. Afterward, Julia, in a state of shock, admitted that she could not even move from the spot, so she remained beside the wounded Brandon for about 40 minutes. During this time, he simply bled out. Julia did not call for help or contact the police. Instead, she turned to her boyfriend to ask for assistance in getting rid of the body. She did not want to go to jail for self-defense, believing that they would not believe her. By this point, investigators no longer believed a word she said. Additionally, the more than a dozen blows found only on the shirt were too much for self-defense. Her story about needing help from her new boyfriend was questionable, as he was known to be a sadist. It is unlikely that he was brought in solely to assist with getting rid of the body. Most likely, he also participated in the crime. However, no solid evidence was found. Julia ended her story by explaining how the body was wrapped in a tarpaulin and discarded off the highway. She insisted that the fabric was used only to disguise the remains. The police were convinced that she could have deliberately used a proven method to conceal human bones to fulfill her morbid fantasies. After all, maniacs are often prone to collecting items that remind them of their crimes. Julia's behavior did not resemble self-defense but clearly indicated an attempt to escape justice. Julia and Jonathan not only disposed of the body but also destroyed Brandon's mobile phone, attempted to eliminate traces of blood in the treehouse. They covered for each other when communicating with the authorities. There were no signs of struggle on Julia, and she was not morally traumatized by the events. Immediately after they disposed of the body, she and Jonathan simply went out for sushi. The detectives were finally able to confirm their suspicions after reviewing Julia's diaries. Judging by the last entries, she perceived Brandon's murder as a kind of gift for her new lover, who shared her peculiarities. Jonathan actively denied his involvement, insisting that he did not report the incident to law enforcement because Julia was scared and convinced him not to do so. She was absolutely certain that she would avoid punishment, as expressed in her diary in a rather crude manner. Additionally, Julia wrote that the torture and murder gave her body pleasure. It is evident that she would not have stopped there. In fact, each subsequent entry in the diary was more alarming than the last. The notes fully revealed the true nature of her interests. Julia repeatedly robbed graves and brought bones to add to her disturbing collection, which her boyfriend seemed not to be bothered by at all. In the first trial, Julia was charged with first-degree murder, and despite the overwhelming amount of evidence against her, she continued to insist that she was the victim of abuse. After her arrest, Jonathan, who was detained 2 weeks later, was charged with concealing evidence of a crime and perjury. He also did not admit guilt. Both were imprisoned and denied bail while awaiting trial. Julia's first trial was scheduled for November 2021. The prosecution insisted that the defendant planned Brandon Chickley's murder as an act of togetherness and a way to fulfill her vicious desires. Julia easily managed to lure him into a trap by promising intimate. Presumably, she brutally dealt with Brandon, then enlisted her new boyfriend to help get rid of the body and the traces of torture. Julia's deviant interests exceeded all reasonable limits. Shortly before Brandon's murder, she went to a family planning clinic to have an abortion. The staff confirmed that she persistently requested to keep the fetus, even attempting to bribe the doctors to allow her to take the unborn child home. It is obvious that the fetus would have become another exhibit in her collection. Of course, the lawyer tried his best to whitewash the image of the defendant and her accomplice. However, considering all the accumulated evidence, this proved to be quite difficult. Their only tactic was to smear the name of Brandon. The defense attorney tried to argue that Brandon was an abusive and a cruel, aggressive person, but all of this sounded extremely unconvincing. When Julia spoke at the trial, she cried while recounting how she was attacked by Brandon. She claimed that she managed to defend her honor only after she stabbed him in the throat, but she could not explain why she inflicted many other wounds. Despite the desperate attempts of the lawyer to defend her, the prosecution successfully painted a truly horrific image of Julia. The jury was adamant and found Julia Enright guilty, not of first-degree murder, but of second-degree murder, considering it an unintentional crime. In March 2022, the court announced the sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Upon hearing this decision, Julia burst into tears again, tearfully expressing that not a day goes by that she does not regret meeting Brandon. Julia never admitted guilt, calling the outcome of the trial a misunderstanding. Jonathan Lind, found guilty of giving false testimony, was sentenced to imprisonment for a term of 7 to 9 years. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Caroline Crouch. This case brings us to Glyka Nera, a coastal town near central Athens in Greece. Caroline Crouch's parents moved to Greece from England when she was 8 years old, and they lived there for all the following years. At the age of 15, Caroline met her future husband, Bobish, in the town of Alonissos, where her parents had settled. Bobish's parents had a summer house for recreation, which he often visited. Although he was 14 years older, Caroline and Bobish eventually started dating and then living together. In 2019, they got married. Bobish was successful and respected. He held the position of helicopter pilot, and Caroline was studying at the university, hoping to enter the School of Public Catering. Caroline, 20, lived there with her 34-year-old husband, Bobish Anagnostopoulos, and her black belt in boxing. She loved animals and got herself a husky puppy when he was only 2 months old. Caroline named the dog Roxy and devoted a lot of time to the pet. In addition to the puppy, there were 4 more cats. A few weeks after their wedding, Caroline found out she was pregnant. Unfortunately, after only 3 months, her pregnancy was interrupted. However, there were no complications. After that, she was able to conceive again and gave birth to a beautiful girl, whom her parents named Lydia. Caroline's world revolved around Lydia. Everyone who knew her said that motherhood was absolutely everything to her. On May 11, 2021, the police received a call from a house in Glica Nera, which turned out to be the home of Caroline and Bobish. The officers were told a story so horrifying that even the oldest and most experienced detectives were in complete shock. When the police arrived at the house in question, they were confronted with a horrific scene. Caroline was severely injured, and little Lydia was screaming and trying to wake her mother up. Tragically, Caroline was lying on the bed and was already dead. Her husband, Bobish, was tied up and handcuffed, with his eyes taped shut. Bobish told the police that a gang of robbers had broken into the house early in the morning while everyone was asleep. One of the gang members put a gun to little Lydia's head and demanded to know where the hidden money was. Bobish indicated where the money was and begged them not to hurt the child. Caroline, who practiced boxing, tried to resist, but several people immediately immobilized her. The leader of the gang personally strangled her, taking all the cash and jewelry. The bandits left, having tied up Bobish and taped his mouth and eyes. As a result, he lost consciousness. When Bobish came to his senses, he managed to find a phone through a small gap in the tape over his eyes using his nose. He dialed the last number in the call log, which was a neighbor's number. When the neighbor picked up, heard muffled sounds and moaning, realizing the situation, the neighbor rushed to Bobish's house, helped him call the police, and recalled later that he had heard some sounds from the neighboring house but did not attach any importance to them. When the police began to inspect the house, they established that more than £10,000 in cash had been stolen, as well as jewelry worth £20,000. Bobish said the family had recently bought a plot of land and had to pay some workers. He also suggested that someone had warned the gang, or that someone within the gang must have known about the family's financial situation in advance. The brutal nature of the crime sent shockwaves throughout Greece and soon spread around the world. The police were equally horrified and commented on how rare such crimes were in their country. The public was outraged and panicked, extending a helping hand to offer support to Bobish and his family. Although there were cameras and video surveillance around the family's house, there was little usable footage, as the cameras were not working or had not been turned on during the robbery and subsequent murder. Footage from an outdoor camera captured a car driving by around the time of the robbery, but the high fence obstructed the view of the make or license plate. Unfortunately, DNA collected from beneath Caroline's fingernails was inconclusive, and there were no witnesses. The only accounts came from the neighbor and Bobish himself. This story spread through the media like wildfire, and soon the world was waiting to see who would be arrested for this terrible crime. Government officials announced a €300,000 reward 3 days after Caroline's death for information about the massacre. All shops, bars, and restaurants on the island of Alonisos closed in solidarity, as 2,000 residents mourned a woman they had accepted as their own and felt deeply insulted by the crime. During the investigation, Bobish was offered to take a test to determine what language the bandits used when they communicated with him. He was able to identify it as Albanian, but this was not certain. After reviewing 150 photographs, Bobish managed to narrow down the list of suspects to 10 people. There was an Albanian gang that had been involved in very brutal robberies, subjecting victims to torture and beatings, with similar cases occurring 6 months prior. The police intensified their efforts to find anyone connected to the gang, utilizing their findings and knowledge, as well as Bobish's list of 10 suspects. They came across one specific person described by Bobish as a broad-shouldered man, approximately 165 centimeters tall, with short blonde hair, a known brutal abuse with a history of hating women. The police began investigating potential connections between this individual and another suspect who had robbed the home of a pilot instructor in Babish's squad 3 years ago. Additionally, the police had another suspect named Yanis, who was also reported to be working with the gang. Soon after the funeral, a resident of Georgia attracted the attention of the authorities due to possessing a fake passport. After DNA samples were taken from him, it turned out he was involved in a home invasion, but it occurred at a different location and happened 4 days before the attack on Caroline's home. Both cases were later scrutinized. Significant differences led to the Georgian resident being eliminated as a suspect when nothing linked him to Caroline's apartment. At the same time, experts expressed concern, noting that as time went on, there was less hope of finding the culprit. Police sources told local media that there was so little evidence found in the house that it seemed as if the robbers had thoroughly cleaned the crime scene and erased their tracks before leaving. Caroline's husband was frequently called to the police station, and he obediently came with a mournful expression, conscientiously answering all of the investigators' many questions. The detectives studied the chronology of those days, the work schedules of Babish and Caroline. They sought as much information as possible about the couple and their relationship. Babish shared much information, but the diary found in the house painted a very different picture than what him presented. In her diary, Caroline described Babish as rude and cruel, revealing that she had been trying to leave him for a long time. Caroline first told her husband about her desire to leave in July 2020, when their daughter Lydia was born. She expressed that she had become increasingly unhappy and was searching for a new home. However, she began to doubt her decision, thinking about her daughter growing up in a single-parent family. Later, she wrote that Babish had control over her and had installed a tracking app on her phone. When Caroline attended therapy sessions, he could hear everything discussed. The couple's family consultant, Elaine, learned from Caroline that she was looking for an apartment in central Athens for herself and Lydia, near the culinary school she dreamed of attending. Despite often visiting a family psychologist with her husband's knowledge, one day, out of the blue, Caroline received a text from Elaine asking her to stop their sessions. She believes this is from the effects of Babish. According to entries in Caroline's diary, tensions were high, and the situation escalated quickly. One entry stated, "Today my baby turned 1 month old. It was also the day I told myself I wanted to leave. I feel terrible." Another entry read, "I am thinking of leaving for my sister, but I know that I can't leave my baby. This life hurts me." They say the psychologist encouraged Caroline to trust her mother, but she replied that she didn't want to disappoint her. Prosecutors claimed the murder was entirely intentional, pointing to the cameras being turned off before the killing and the memory cards being removed as calculated coincidences. 38 days after the scene of violence and robbery, during a memorial service for Caroline, police officers approached Babish with a request to come with them for another interrogation. Babish begged to wait until the service ended, but he was told this matter could not wait, as someone had been detained and his identification was needed. He was advised not to call anyone and to hide his phone while following them. This was actually a set-up, as the police needed Babish himself as a suspect. The entire situation was becoming increasingly confusing and hard to believe. Inconsistencies and discrepancies emerged. Based on Caroline's diary entries and Babish's story, the police realized they needed to focus on him rather than looking for a gang. When analyzing data from Caroline's smartwatch, they found that she had been in a state of extreme mental or physical stress for 6 minutes around 4 a.m., leading them to conclude that she died at a different time than what Babish claimed. Geolocation data from his phone indicated that Babish had been walking up and down the stairs of the house for several hours, just when he claimed he was tied up by gangsters and unable to move. After 8 hours of intense questioning and reviewing all the evidence the police had gathered, Babish finally broke down. He played the part for weeks, but now the police assert that the gang attack story was a lie and that he himself killed his wife because she threatened to leave him, then staged the crime scene. An examination of some evidence and digital data has provided clues. If the police are correct, then this crime comes down to the actions of one cruel husband. Babish admitted that the robbery was staged. The acts committed against Caroline and her beloved dog were horrific. The police noted that when they arrived at the crime scene on May 11th, they already had suspicions about Bobish but lacked sufficient evidence. He had played a cunning game, cooperating with the press to manipulate the narrative of his grief, all while deceiving everyone. The police wondered if there was another potential motive for the murder: money. It turned out that Bobish had led a very wasteful lifestyle. Recently, they had gone on a luxurious holiday, during which they spent a large sum of money. They also bought land and designed their dream home worth £14,000. There was also information that Bobish had been involved in the transportation of banned substance, earning money for his luxurious lifestyle by transporting them via his helicopter. Caroline's father is sure that there is a lot of truth in this information, having studied the chronology of events and the data the police compiled. In Bobish's testimony, what happened in the early morning of May 11th was concerning. At some point in the evening, Caroline texted her friend that she was leaving Bobish. Data from her phone showed that she had been trying to book a hotel for herself for the next day, but she decided to spend that night at home. At 12:35 a.m., Bobish was seen at their child's crib while Caroline was upstairs texting her friend. At 1:20 a.m., Bobish took out the memory card from the CCTV camera inside the house. Then they started to quarrel over the text messages. According to this data, Caroline's pulse jumped 50% at 4:05 a.m. when Bobish smothered her with a pillow. 5 to 6 minutes later, at 4:11 a.m. the watch stopped recording her heartbeat. He placed their young daughter next to her dead mother on the bed in an attempt to create a convincing and shocking crime scene. He then threw clothes around the house to stage a robbery. At one point, he also got rid of Caroline's pet husky. The finale of his scheme was tying himself up and taping himself. Just 2 hours later, at 6 a.m., Bobish called to report a fake robbery. An expert stated that Caroline died in torment, and, with the help of her smartwatch, it became clear that she was resisting with all her might. In his speech in court, Bobish described the strangulation of his wife as a hug. He claimed that Caroline tried to move away from him while they were lying in bed, so he held her tightly. When she tried to turn face down, he continued to hold her, pressing her hard against the pillow until she stopped moving. This continued for 5 minutes. Afterward, it seemed like Bobish tried to stir her or wake her up, but it was in vain, and then he realized that it was all over. Bobish claimed that he killed Caroline to protect his daughter. According to him, his wife was cruel, verbally abusive towards both him and Lydia, and he acted in the heat of the moment. He insisted that when he killed his wife, he had no intention of lying and that all his actions were driven by the desire to protect his daughter. This statement was considered very unfair and offensive to those who knew Caroline. Lydia was her life. Caroline idolized her child and would never have allowed harm to come to her baby. Bobish Anagnostopoulos was charged with 2 serious crimes: first, murder in a completely calm mental state, and second, cruelty to animals. Additionally, he was accused of repeatedly giving false testimony, thus misleading the investigation. Although his lawyers worked to defend him and argued that the murder was committed under the influence of emotions, this should not affect the fair verdict of the court. The case has caused a public outcry and prompted protesters to march in the streets with signs and slogans declaring "No to domestic violence." On May 16, 2022, about a month after the trial began, a jury found Bobish guilty of manslaughter while in a calm state, murder of a domestic animal, false reporting, and false testimony. He was sentenced to life in prison and an additional 10 years for the execution of a domestic dog, as well as a fine of €21,000. Additionally, Bobish received another year and 6 months for misleading the authorities. Caroline's parents wanted to erase all mention of Bobish from their memory in any way they could. They began by removing the word "wife" from the tombstone on Caroline's grave. It now reads "Mother and Daughter, Caroline Crouch." They were also granted full custody of baby Lydia, while Bobish's parents were denied custody but allowed to visit their granddaughter 5 times a month. Despite everything, Bobish and Caroline's parents maintain a good relationship and work to ensure Lydia has a happy life. The Caroline Crouch case is not only a family tragedy but also a heartbreaking reminder of the reality of domestic violence hidden behind a perfect facade. More than a year after Caroline's tragic death on May 11, 2021, the sentence handed down to Bobish and Agnostopoulos has closed a painful chapter, bringing some measure of justice to her and her family, although it cannot erase the suffering they have endured. The life sentence and additional penalties not only punish Bobish's cruel actions but also send a strong message that such crimes will not be tolerated, regardless of how skillfully the perpetrators attempt to cover them up. For the Greek community and the world, this case has evoked deep sympathy and sparked a movement against domestic violence, urging people to reconsider the potential dangers in their own homes. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Carolyn Watson. If kidnapping is not about satisfying the criminal's painful desires, then most often, the attackers seek money. But it is not always that simple. Some frightening actions have a much more mundane nature. Budgeree, in Australia, does not seem like a place where something terrifying could happen. It is a rural and remote area with a population of fewer than 200 people. Located in the peaceful region of Victoria, it is not even marked on all maps. The local community consists of only a few dozen families, and everyone knows each other well. However, this calm and measured pace did not prevent criminal stories from surfacing. The media began to write about the quiet and prosperous life in Budgeree, which changed in 2008 due to an event that made the entire continent shudder. A man named Julian Buchwald, 25, lived there. His family owns a large piece of land in the area. Julian had a girlfriend, 17-year-old Carolyn Watson, who lived in a neighboring town. They had been dating for about 2 years. Even in his younger years, Julian loved to explore the surroundings, especially his plot of land, to satisfy his natural curiosity. The difficult terrain, combined with the abundance of vegetation, offered plenty of opportunities for imagination and exploration. Both Julian and Carolyn continued to live with their parents. Despite dating for 2 years, they were very serious about their relationship. They often discussed the prospects of marriage. Being deeply religious individuals, just like their families, they even visited the local pastor of the church to declare their desire to marry during a Sunday service, where they had first met. Faith played a significant role in their lives. On the morning of March 4, 2008, Julian picked up Carolyn from her home for a picnic. She lived in the neighboring town of Churchill, which was a bit larger, with about 5,000 people. It was located about 20 minutes away by car from Budgeree. After leaving, they returned to Julian's house because he had forgotten some food in the car that could spoil in the heat. They gathered everything they needed and quickly left before it got too hot. Typically, Julian and Carolyn would relax on Julian's family property, where there were plenty of secluded spots that looked picturesque for a romantic outing. However, this time, they decided to venture further to visit a nearby waterfall. Around 3 p.m., they planned to return. Most of the journey went smoothly, but just before reaching the waterfall, Julian suddenly became alarmed. He noticed the carcass of an animal on the side of the road, so he slowed down and stopped at a safe distance around a small bend. He told Carolyn that he wanted to get out to check, as he thought the animal might still be alive and he could help it. This curiosity wasn't unusual for him. Carolyn had gotten used to these quirks and decided to wait for him inside the SUV while following his movements in the rearview mirror. At some point, Carolyn became distracted. When she looked back again, she no longer saw Julian. She assumed he had gone behind the hill or a turn, which is why she was out of view. But after some time, Julian still hadn't returned, and this began to worry her. He always came back quickly. Realizing they were far from the city and in the wilderness, Carolyn was afraid to get out of the car. Her boyfriend's absence increasingly troubled her. Suddenly, she caught sight of something even more frightening in the mirror. A figure darted into view. She saw a man standing next to the car. He looked threatening, fully dressed with gloves, and wearing a balaclava. Carolyn intended to lock the doors of the car, but the stranger had already jumped to her side, opened the door. Before she could react, pulled her out of the car and threw her to the ground. He covered her mouth with tape, silencing her screams, and she could barely resist. Within minutes, the kidnapper had bound and blindfolded her, then shoved her into the trunk of his car. Terrified, Carolyn hoped that Julian would return to save her. However, the kidnapper got behind the wheel and drove away, leaving her alone with her fear. She tried to escape, but the ropes were too tight to loosen. It felt like the trip lasted several hours. Eventually, the SUV came to a stop, the trunk opened. The kidnapper, still wearing a balaclava and gloves, stood in front of her again. He threw her onto the ground, and Carolyn realized she was still unable to free herself from her bindings. Despite her desperate attempts to do so, she had little idea of where she was located, but she saw that there was a dense forest surrounding her. The stranger tore off her clothes, using a knife to cut away her underwear, and then walked away. Carolyn was completely naked, lying next to the car. She heard a sound as if the kidnapper was digging. This noise came from a few meters away. Carolyn realized that she was about to die. She could not imagine what awaited her, but she understood that she would not get out of here alive. The only thing she could do in such a situation was to pray. At that time, Julian's mother and father noticed their absence and that both had left by car. Julian and Carolyn told their parents that they were going on a picnic together but did not specify the location. They were expected to return around 3 p.m., but the clock now read around 5 p.m. While everything could be attributed to youth and passion, Julian and Carolyn was always very responsible, was never late, especially for an extended period. Julian's mother called her son, but he didn't answer. Carolyn also ignored the calls. This was uncharacteristic for them, as they always stayed in touch. A delay of several hours seemed unthinkable, considering that they had not warned anyone that they would be late. The parents inspected the area around the house but found no traces of Julian and Carolyn. A search operation alone on such a large piece of land seemed pointless, so Julian's mother decided to return to the house and wait for them in the driveway. Suddenly, she discovered something strange. She saw a glint as from glass and found a bottle with a note inside that was stuck in the fence mesh. She read it, and its contents horrified her. Some criminal had written that he had kidnapped Julian and Carolyn. The text was full of obscene language. The criminal warned the parents not to report it to the police, otherwise, Carolyn would be burned alive, and Julian would die in agony. The kidnapper spoke of some business he had to attend to, stating that if he succeeded, the children would return home safe and sound, but only if the parents complied with all his demands. This message horrified she. Though she panicked, she was not going to follow the demands of the criminal and reported the matter to the police. Law enforcement officers immediately responded to the call and began to inspect the area, which was rugged terrain with a lot of vegetation. There was much work to be done. Relatives hoped that Julian and Carolyn had secluded themselves in the area since they rarely left Butchery. The family's situation worsened when Julian's relatives found out that both Julian's and Carolyn's families had received ominous notes. The families of Julian and Carolyn and the detectives met to discuss what had happened. Carolyn's father found a similar bottle on the porch of their house, which contained a message insisting that they not contact the police, also threatening to kill Julian and Carolyn. Even worse, he promised to deal with the entire family if his demands were violated. Everyone wondered what could possibly have motivated the hatred toward this sweet couple of young people. Initially, it was believed that that were just a cruel joke. Now the police had two notes, as well as the real disappearance of Julian and Carolyn. Until late in the evening, neither Julian nor Carolyn had made contact. The handwriting in both letters was identical. That means that the two families may have a common enemy. However, no one had the slightest idea who he might be. It was curious that the note contained a symbol that seemed to have an occult nature. Some group that considered Christians their enemies. This was considered a valuable clue, and it was quickly discovered that it was used by a certain satanic cult called the Order of Nine Angles. The history of this organization was checked and found that it had appeared in Great Britain back in the 60s, was actively luring in members in the 70s. However, the cult did not become widespread and did not have a large number of followers. Some of its members were being held accountable for extremist ideology and various threats. As the activists gained notoriety, the group opened branches in several countries around the world. Their ideology included isolating their members from the rest of society. They openly advocated for violence and committing crimes against perceived enemies, specifically targeting Christians whom they recognized as opponents to be destroyed. The most frightening aspect of this movement's activities was the propaganda promoting human sacrifices, which horrified families and prompted the police to intensify their efforts. Julian and Carolyn were simply devout Christians. Interestingly, until that point, the activities of this group had only been observed in Australia. They could potentially attempt to declare themselves by committing their first ritual murder. Satanists might use the sacrifice of Julian and Carolyn to gain fame from there began to gather like-minded people. The relatives did not receive any news for several days. Julian's car was declared wanted, but that didn't help. All the detectives' efforts proved in vain as they couldn't find either Julian and Carolyn or any leads on where to continue searching. Considering who Carolyn and Julian may have contacted, it was believed that it would be impossible to return they alive. The relatives knew that they had packed only a small amount of food meant to last a few hours. They had no worn clothes and no equipment. They did not have tents to survive the temperature fluctuations that occur in Australia during the day and night. There were also concerns about dangerous areas where Julian and Carolyn could fall victim to predators. The scorching heat and hunger posed significant threats. Even if they escaped from their kidnappers, encounters with wild or poisonous animals could be deadly. The rescue operation transitioned to a recovery effort, but this, too, yielded no results. 6 days passed during which the families of Julian and Carolyn did not find any peace. Suddenly, a message arrived: Julian and Carolyn had been found. What was most astonishing was that both were relatively safe. They had simply emerged onto the roadway near the Alpine National Park. A passing farmer stopped to help and immediately reported their situation to the police. It was not surprising that law enforcement officers were unable to find any trace of the individuals Julian and Carolyn. The national park was several hundred kilometers from where they lived, requiring about a 6-hour drive by car. Julian sustained serious injuries. While making their way through the desert, he suffered sunburn, cuts from thorny bushes, blisters, and bruises all over his body. Nonetheless, aside from the extreme stress of their ordeal, they were otherwise fine. Detectives met with Julian and Carolyn to gather information and prevent potentially dangerous criminals from operating in the area. They first communicated with Carolyn, who detailed the horrific trials she endured after being kidnapped. She described being undressed, thrown to the ground, where she lay and prayed just a few meters away from her kidnapper, who was digging in the earth. She was certain that this was her grave. This agonizing wait continued interminably until the sounds of digging stopped. Carolyn heard footsteps moving away, and everything went silent. Realizing that the criminal had abandoned her, she knew she could not remain passive. Quickly, she attempted to free herself from her ropes, but they did not yield. Her hands hurt as she rubbed them until they bled. Suddenly, she heard Julian's voice calling her name as he crawled closer. He managed to rip off her blindfold and the duct tape from her mouth. Julian, also tied up and without clothes, had managed to free his hands. This allowed Julian to finally escape and then free Carolyn. However, the danger was not over. The kidnapper could return at any moment. There was no car, but the abandoned backpack and scattered contents of the trunk remained. They found supplies that they had taken with them for a picnic, gathered everything, and fled into the thicket. They wanted to get as far away from that place as possible to plan their next steps. Along the way, Julian recounted his story. He approached an animal lying on the side of the road to examine the body, but as he leaned over, he heard footsteps approaching quickly from behind. He didn't have time to react before he was attacked. He was struck on the back of the head hard enough to lose consciousness. According to Julian, when he awoke a few hours later, he immediately began calling out for Carolyn. The criminal was no longer nearby, having escaped in an SUV. Over the next few days, they desperately tried to reach the road, making their way through thick bushes. They risked encountering wild animals. Even the slightest bite from an Australian poisonous spider or snake could be fatal. Their supplies were very limited since they had packed only a small amount of food for their picnic, specifically. During the day, Julian and Carolyn suffered from the suffocating heat, risking sunstroke. At night, they struggled to stay warm, sharing a single sleeping bag. The situation was compounded by the fear that the kidnapper could pursue them and find them at any moment. Both Julian and Carolyn were completely unaware of why this had happened to them. The situation worsened when, a few days later, they unwittingly returned to the same place where they had been held hostage. As it turned out, they had made a large circle. Nevertheless, Julian took advantage of the situation. Despite his fear of being caught, he was able to steal clothes and any remaining food, improving the dire condition of the starving couple. However, everything came to an end quickly. Carolyn fell into despair, feeling that they could not be saved, and found solace only in prayer. Finally, God heard her pleas. After 6 days, they were able to find their way out of the dense bushes. They emerged onto the road, where the police spoke to Julian, for the most part, confirmed his girlfriend's account, except for the part where he claimed to be unconscious. Julian and Carolyn was sent to stay in the hospital and then with their relatives, but law enforcement officers had no time to rest. Despite the miraculous rescue of the kidnapping victims, the armed forces still faced a real threat that the dangerous organization responsible for the kidnapping would continue its destructive activities. It had to be stopped at any cost. Before bloodshed could begin, the police decided to go to the place from which the prisoners had escaped. They found cut pieces of duct tape, clothing, a shovel, and other items, all of which were checked. To the detectives' amazement, some items belonged to Julian, including a rope found in his house's barn. There was also disturbed earth that had been dug up. The detectives discovered a balaclava, black clothing, gloves, and other things described by Carolyn. From that moment, Julian's story became even more disturbing. In particular, Julian was never able to show any signs of the head injuries he claimed to have sustained. Any such injuries should have remained visible, especially if Julian had indeed delivered a blow that could have knocked him out for several hours. They decided to talk to Julian again. From the start, the detectives made it clear that they had good reason to suspect him of kidnapping. Julian was nervous but insisted on his story, referring to his beloved, who confirmed much of what he said. However, within a few hours, he was brought to justice. Julian admitted that he had organized the kidnapping himself. He had bought the items he intended to use for the kidnapping in advance, taking some from home, including items that allowed him to hide his face from Carolyn. He had even trained for some time to tie knots that would not injure when immobilizing someone. The cult symbols used in the letters were meant to scare his parents and Carolyn's relatives into not contacting the police, preventing detective intervention. Julian deliberately used foul language in the letters he sent to the Buchwald and Watson families. No one thought he would say such words. Julian had deliberately chosen the longest route to the waterfall to avoid detection and confuse the tracks. The guy kept a lookout for anything suspicious that could attract attention and give him the opportunity to implement his plan. He eventually noticed an animal carcass on the side of the road and decided it was time to act. Julian stopped around a corner to hide from Carolyn's sight, changed his clothes, and returned to the car to play out the rest. The place he had chosen to take Carolyn was far away, allowing them to stay away from people. According to him, when Carolyn heard sounds of earth being dug up, he was actually not making a grave but getting rid of evidence. After that, he got into the car and drove away to hide it in the woods, then he returned to Carolyn. Along the way, he got rid of his clothes and wrapped ropes around his hands to make himself look like a kidnapped person. After that, he began to call her name in a weak voice, pretending that he had just regained consciousness after a blow to the head. The kidnapping was carefully planned. He had items that helped they survive this difficult period. Even the fact that they returned to the place from which they had escaped was part of the plan. However, one aspect still remained unclear. Why stage such a spectacle? 22-year-old Julian admitted that he wanted to marry Carolyn immediately. They had already been dating for 2 years, but she did not agree. 17-year-old Carolyn planned to finish school, decide on her future, go to college, get a job, become independent before finally tying the knot and starting a family. At the same time, both were devout Christians who believed in abstaining from intimate before marriage. He did not want to wait so long. He desperately wanted to satisfy his intimate desires, so he staged the kidnapping. He specifically planned everything so that they would both be isolated during their wandering through the dense thickets. Julian tried various tactics to persuade his girlfriend to be intimate. He reasoned that they might not survive this adventure, and it was worth trying intimate. He also convinced Carolyn that in the face of death, they had entered into an alliance in the fight for their lives, which he equated with marriage. Julian even tried to persuade her that they needed to engage in intimate intercourse to keep warm at night, claiming he had read about such a method somewhere. Carolyn was unwavering, continued to refuse, and insisted on her beliefs, convinced that God would save them. Therefore, his plan ultimately failed. Among the items Julian had prepared for the trip, there was a map of the national park. They had not actually gotten lost when Julian realized Carolyn was not going to give up. Therefore, he decided to lead them out of this national park. After Julian's confession, he was slapped by Carolyn, charged with kidnapping and perjury. The trial was scheduled for August 2009. Julian was not held in jail after the trial because his wealthy family posted bail. Julian took advantage of the situation and made another attempt to escape punishment. In September 2009, he obtained an Indian passport, boarded a plane, and flew to China. The document was obviously fake but of sufficient quality to fool Australian security services. Julian dyed his hair black and spent a long time sunbathing to darken his skin as much as possible, even though he was fair-skinned and required many tanning sessions. Although he managed to fly out of Australia, the Indian security services were more vigilant and refused to let him enter the country. Julian was arrested in Singapore. It was assumed that India was only the first stop on his journey and that Germany was intended to be his final destination. After that, he received a sentence of 7 years and 3 months for kidnapping, as well as an additional 6 months for escaping. He tried to challenge the court's decision, arguing that it was too harsh, but could not contest the fact that the kidnapping in this incident was a significant issue. In another unexpected turn of events, it was revealed that Julian was originally from Germany. His family had moved to Australia at an early age. In 2014, the Immigration Service considered the possibility of canceling his visa. Julian tried to resist this decision but failed. In 2016, he was deported to Germany, ending up in a country where he did not know the language at all. There were no relatives or acquaintances with whom he could start anew. His further fate is not reliably known, and there is no information about whether he went to prison. According to some sources, Julian's situation has worsened. On the other hand, Carolyn could not come to her senses for a long time after such a betrayal. It was difficult for her to learn to trust people, especially men. What happened in her life afterward is unknown. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Gemma Mitchell. In June 2021, a devout Christian, Mi Kun Chong, also known as Deborah, disappeared without a trace. Her friends had no idea what to do in this situation, as it was extremely out of character for her, especially since Deborah was vulnerable, a weak woman who could not stand up for herself. Just when the investigation began to gain momentum, a heartbreaking discovery was made. A long series of CCTV footage led the authorities to a cold-blooded killer. This crime story happened quite recently in the UK and tells the story of one of the first women whose sentencing was broadcast live on television. All happened in northwest London, where 67-year-old Deborah lived in her home. She was born and raised in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, but later moved to the Wembley area of the UK in 2004. She lived alone and shared her two-story house with a tenant. Deborah was a parishioner of the Emmanuel Church Center, located about 6 miles from her home. Being a pious woman, she regularly attended church services. Neighbors described Deborah as a cheerful, active, but slightly eccentric older woman who regularly visited her neighbors' houses for tea and company. As Deborah was a believer and a frequent churchgoer, she met many people over the years, which helped her fit in and become part of her local Wembley community. However, not all was well in her life. Unfortunately, Deborah suffered from several mental health issues, was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and acute stress. Fortunately, Deborah had a few people she could rely on, and one of the women she became close to was a 38-year-old named Gemma Mitchell. Gemma previously lived in Australia for 7 years. She was an osteopath who decided to return to the UK in 2015. Her mother and sister lived in Brent, North Wembley, and Gemma stayed with them. Her family was relatively well off. She received a good education and then went to King's College London, where she earned a degree in humanities that included a course in experimental anatomy. During her studies, Gemma proved to be an outstanding medical student and received awards for her knowledge of the human body. Her mother worked for the British Foreign Office, and the family's property in London was valued at approximately $5 million. Unfortunately, the family had recently fallen on hard times. The house was abandoned and in urgent need of repair. Gemma presented herself as a pious person, which was similar to Deborah. They met at the church in August 2020. Unfortunately, Gemma was unable to work as an osteopath in the UK due to the discrepancy between Australian and British practices and found herself essentially without a job. However, to bring Deborah closer, Gemma offered her services as a spiritual healer to help Deborah cope with her mental disorders. It is clear that this could not in any way address Deborah's current problems, as her schizophrenia persisted. By the spring of 2021, she was prescribed stronger medications. The people around her began to notice that Deborah had become more vulnerable and prone to strange behavior. In recent months, she had developed an obsession with Prince Charles and Boris Johnson. It's quite a sad story. Deborah believed that she had a parasocial relationship with Prince Charles and she could talk to him through a video on YouTube. She often set the table for the Prince and Boris Johnson as if they were going to show up at her house at any moment. After sending them several strange letters, she received a referral for psychiatric treatment. After Deborah was admitted to a medical facility for 2 weeks, she was prescribed a new course of medications. Although she did not want to take them, her friends persuaded her to go back. After that, for the most part, Deborah's life returned to normal. Her friends rejoiced with her and looked forward to the summer. However, on June 11, 2021, she suddenly disappeared. On that day, Deborah's lodger began to worry when he could not find her or contact her. Given the current state of her mental health, he knew it would be wise to immediately report this to the authorities. The tenant had seen Deborah the day before, so she could not have been gone for very long. CCTV footage recently confirmed this. The footage showed Deborah walking along Chaplin Road accompanied by her lodger. It is worth noting that Deborah did not walk very well, so if she was on the run, it would have been difficult for her to manage without transportation. As the days passed, it became increasingly obvious that something unusual had happened to Deborah. She had never disappeared like that before. Given her mental health and physical problems, this painted a worrying picture for the authorities. But despite Deborah's silence, some news about her emerged. Gemma informed Deborah's tenant that Deborah had decided to return home to Malaysia to spend time with her family. According to Gemma, Deborah had decided to return home for a year to clear her head. This raised doubts among police officers. To fly to Malaysia, Deborah would have had to present her passport at customs, but there were no stamps recorded on it. No one had seen her leave the house, no local taxi companies had given her a lift, and there was no banking activity indicating that she had used any public transport. Days turned, and there were still no confirmed sightings of Deborah. However, 16 days after she went missing, a discovery was made 200 miles from Wembley. There was a small coastal town called Salcombe. It has beautiful beaches and lovely nature. Many people visit this area as tourists. One woman who came to discover the beauty of new places found much more than she expected. On June 27, 2021, the woman was walking with her family along Bennett Road in Salcombe when she saw a nightmarish scene as she descended the old steps. Nearby lay a decomposing body, and the head was missing. The authorities were immediately called, and upon their arrival, forensic experts found that the body had been dumped along with a church business card and excerpts from the Bible. They soon became known that the body belonged to Mikun Chom. Due to the state of decomposition, an autopsy was unable to determine her exact cause of death. However, it could be said with certainty that she was missing her head. Injuries consistent with an assault were found on her body. Pathologists also believed that Deborah had been dead for about 2 weeks, which was consistent with the time of her disappearance. With the case now classified as a murder, investigators stepped up their efforts to find Deborah's killer, and surprisingly, it didn't take them long to find a potential suspect. CCTV footage from around Deborah's home revealed some very disturbing movements. As officers checked all the friends who knew Deborah, they began to focus on her life. Deborah would periodically hold seances in her garden, and Gemma was often with her. Friends reported that Deborah repeatedly mentioned that Gemma and Jesus healed her. These two women had previously been friends, but at least a week before Deborah disappeared, they may have quarreled over money. This theory was taken into consideration by the officers. Working in the field of osteopathy in Australia, Gemma stated on her professional website that she focused on the genetics of anatomy and the dissection of human cadavers. However, after she returned to England in 2015, she was no longer able to continue her professional life as a result of her circumstances. Gemma worked nowhere else, although she lived with her mother in their old family home in Brent. According to eyewitnesses, the rooms were filled with broken furniture and rubbish. Some rooms were impossible to enter. There were boxes and suitcases, freezers full of food, old mattresses, and building materials everywhere. The kitchen was described as very dirty, with various remains of rotting food on the stove and torn food packaging. The second floor of the house was under renovation, the walls and ceilings were unfinished, there was no roof. The bathroom was stained and in very poor condition. Overall, the whole house looked terrible. Maybe, this house was the cause of the conflict between Deborah and Gemma. According to the collected messages, to renovate Gemma's family home, Deborah was asked to give her 200,000 British pound, and Deborah promised her this. However, after a while, Deborah advised Gemma to sell the house and enjoy the money because life is too short. In a subsequent message, Deborah told Gemma that further repairs and construction would cost a lot of money, which Deborah had nothing for. And from that moment on, the relationship between them deteriorated. Over the next few days, Gemma became more and more persistent and aggressive towards Deborah. On June 8, 2021, Deborah finally got tired of listening to Gemma's complaints and sent her an SMS in which she wrote, "Until you resolve the issue with the house, I do not want you to come to me. I am experiencing stress from your presence." Just 3 days after this, Deborah disappeared. Fortunately, many surveillance cameras filled in all the gaps and allowed law enforcement to create a clear picture of what happened. At 6:15 a.m. on June 11th, Gemma was seen leaving her abandoned house with a large travel suitcase and a backpack on her shoulders. At that time, she was wearing a hat. By 6:40 a.m., Gemma had already changed her clothes, covered her face with a mask, and put her backpack inside the suitcase. In this CCTV footage, Gemma can be seen moving towards Deborah's house. At 7:56 a.m., she took off her hat. However, she could still be seen with the suitcase and mask on her face. Presumably, Deborah was tragically killed in the next 4 hours, because at 12:05 p.m., Gemma was again caught on CCTV, this time carrying 2 suitcases. They both seemed quite heavy as she struggled to carry them. The smaller suitcase most likely contained personal belongings and Deborah's financial documents, which Gemma needed for her further actions, as she intended to use them to create a will. Then, she called a taxi to take her with the 2 suitcases to the right address, but Gemma had to wait for the car for 40 minutes. It was only at 4:15 p.m. that she returned home with a large blue suitcase. Later that evening, Gemma went to a hospital located in the center of town for treatment of a broken finger. She told the doctors that she accidentally pinched her finger in a door. In the following days, in an attempt to cover up the crime, Gemma sent several fraudulent emails to a missing persons charity, and she sent a message to Deborah's tenant to say that the lady of the house had gone to Malaysia to visit relatives. Now, let's fast forward a few days and see that Gemma is on the move again. On June 26 at 8:05 a.m., a CCTV camera across the road from her house recorded Gemma booting up as she had rented a car from a car rental company the night before. On the way to Salcombe, she stopped at a gas station, where a surveillance camera captured her entering the store. After this, Gemma drove another 200 miles southwest to a coastal town. She parked her car near Bennett Road at about 9:12 p.m., where she found a secluded spot to dump the body. She was seen leaving the area 41 minutes later by the same camera. Now, despite being caught on several surveillance cameras, Gemma thought her plan had worked out well. However, there was one part of her carefully thought out scheme that even she couldn't predict. On the way back to London, her rental car had a ruptured inner tube, so Gemma had to stop at a service station and call a repairman to change the tire. This man still remembers his strange encounter with her. She seemed confused and bewildered, insisted that he not climb into the trunk of her car, not to mention putting a tire in there. Additionally, she wanted to keep the old flat tire. The repairman also noted that the car had a strange, heavy, and musty smell, as if someone had been sleeping in it without any ventilation. Unfortunately, he didn't know this at the time, but the car smelled of death when he had her tire fixed. Gemma returned home, where she returned the Volvo and threw the blue suitcase on the roof of a barn belonging to one of the neighbors. The very next day, Deborah's decapitated body was found. The authorities would need another 5 days to find her head. All these clues naturally pointed to Gemma, and the authorities decided to pay a small visit to her 15 minutes before midnight, taking her into custody. Gemma was immediately handcuffed, and the police began to search the house, looking for evidence that could link Gemma to Deborah's murder. As a result, Deborah's personal belongings and financial documents were found, as well as a fake will from Deborah that had been created on a computer. In this will, Gemma named herself and her mother as the beneficiaries of Deborah's entire estate, which was valued at the time at approximately £700,000. Gemma's first official interrogation was held 2 days later and was filled with a whole host of evidence, questions that Gemma did not answer. There are a great many surveillance cameras in modern London, and the fact that Gemma thought her journey with a heavy suitcase containing Deborah's body would go unnoticed did not work. Apparently, Gemma became more open during the interrogation and realized that she had no hope of justifying herself. Thus, during the first and subsequent interrogations, she remained silent, refusing to provide her version of events. Despite her refusal to cooperate with the investigation, the trial of Gemma Mitchell began a year later. On October 11, 2022, Gemma Mitchell not only denied killing Deborah but also refused to testify in her own defense. Her defense team claimed that there was no evidence to support the assertion that Deborah's body had been kept in the suitcase and that no evidence of a struggle was found in Deborah's house. Additionally, no weapon was discovered that could have separated the head from the body. But still, the motive for this crime was alleged to be money. The prosecution claimed that Gemma killed Deborah in order to forge a will and obtain money for home repairs. A notable level of heartlessness was revealed when it was noted that in the period between the murder and her trip with Deborah's body in the suitcase to Salcombe, Gemma went on a date with someone she had met on the internet at the London Zoo. It is worth noting once again that Gemma graduated with a first-class honors degree in the humanities, including a course in experimental anatomy, meaning she had the skills to remove a head from a body, although it is unclear why she did this. The deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict on October 27, 2022. Gemma Mitchell was formally found guilty of the murder of 67-year-old Mi Kun Chom. Gemma's conviction made national headlines. During the sentencing phase of the trial, which was broadcast live on television, Gemma became the first convicted murderer in England and Wales to be sentenced live, as well as being the first woman in the UK to have her sentence filmed. The judge's words to Gemma were quoted as follows. He stated that she had left her residence early in the morning with a large suitcase that, as shown on surveillance camera, was either empty or contained very little. He mentioned that she took public transport to Deborah's residence and stayed there for more than 4 hours. The judge noted that the suitcase she brought home was now clearly full and heavy. He expressed no doubt that she had killed Deborah in her home and concluded that, considering she had not provided any explanation during her interrogations, she had gone to Mi Kun Chom's house that morning with the intent to kill. He remarked that she showed absolutely no remorse and seemed to completely deny what she had done. With the irrefutable evidence against her, the judge announced that Gemma Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 34 years, which meant that Gemma would not be eligible for parole until July 10, 2055. During Gemma's trial, a statement from Deborah's sister, who lived in Malaysia, was read to the court. In this statement, the sister wrote, "They still don't understand how she died. This secret will haunt she forever." Gemma never accepted responsibility for Deborah's murder, leaving many questions unanswered. However, for many, the motive appears clear and simple. Deborah was a vulnerable woman seeking help for her mental health problems. She confided in her friend Gemma, even offering her a significant amount of her savings to help with the house. But Gemma's actions constituted a vile and disgusting crime. Since Gemma's conviction, several of her former friends have come forward to share their own experiences with her, revealing that she had always tried to steal money, lured partners, and was a real snake. In the end, the case of Gemma Mitchell stands as a chilling reminder of how trust can be exploited in the most sinister ways. What began as a friendship rooted in shared faith and mutual support spiraled into a calculated act of betrayal, driven by greed and desperation. Deborah's tragic fate not only shattered the lives of those who knew her but also left an indelible mark on the UK's legal history, with Gemma's sentencing etched into public memory through its unprecedented live broadcast. As Gemma serves her life sentence, the unanswered questions surrounding Deborah's final moments linger, a haunting echo of a crime that stripped away a vulnerable woman's life and exposed the dark depths of human nature. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Jen Carson. James Carson was a typical American in the 80s. He married a girl named Lynn, and they had a daughter named Jen. James was not particularly intelligent. He was more focused on family and children, always treating his loved ones with great love. He was a devoted father, but during that time, the hippie culture was gaining momentum, and James did not shy away from it. He loved to have fun and indulged in the forbidden. Nevertheless, his daughter remembered him as a very caring man who often told her stories at night. James did not work. Instead, his more educated wife, who had a decent job, provided for the family. At first, it appeared to be a loving union, but over the years, striking changes began to occur in him. He became increasingly rude and aggressive, bought himself a gun, and periodically threatened his wife with it. Lynn decided it was better to separate after 10 years of marriage. Their 5-year-old daughter Jen was too young to understand what was happening. Most of the events that unfolded remained a mystery to her until she grew older and learned the shocking truth about her father. However, the key character in this story is not only James but also Susan, a woman born into a wealthy family in the 60s. Her father was a highly successful producer who granted her a lavish lifestyle. She could only dream of such a life. She married another wealthy man, resulting in 2 children. However, as Susan's children reached their teenage years, she grew weary of the daily routine and wanted to get the most out of life. Therefore, she began a second secret life, which she kept hidden from her family. Susan became quite dissolute, preferring much younger men with whom she engaged in intimate relationships. One of her young lovers introduced her to banned substance, which had become widespread at that time. This marked the beginning of the end of her idyllic life. It turned out that Susan had not only secret affairs but also mental health issues, which no one had ever addressed. The lack of treatment combined with her reckless lifestyle led to exacerbations of her condition, resulting in regular hallucinations, even when she was in a normal state of consciousness. One day, her husband returned home from work to find triangles drawn on all the walls. Susan spoke of visual hallucinations and showed signs of schizophrenia. Her husband uncovered her little secrets about her affairs on the side and discovered her mental disorders. However, he did not condemn his wife and took the situation calmly. Unfortunately, he was not willing to help her and simply filed for divorce. Given the problems Susan was facing, he easily obtained full custody of their children. This outcome seemed to suit her completely. She did not even attempt to challenge the court's decision. Now she was alone, without her children, and still full of a desire to have fun. Additionally, after the divorce, Susan received a substantial amount of money, which led her to throw a big party at her home, where James also appeared. Susan was almost 10 years older than James, yet he fit her interests. Their acquaintance was intensified by the use of strong illegal substances. Susan's issues escalated to such a degree that she began to believe she was hallucinating. Their meeting coincided with James's divorce, and nothing could restrain the lovers. Several months passed, and their strange relationship was marked by emotional highs and lows. Later, Susan said that she had immediately fallen in love with James and that he became the man of her dreams. He officially changed his name to Michael Bear Carson, and in 1978, they went on a trip to Europe in search of their spiritual followers. Soon, the situation only worsened, as all of Susan's savings from the divorce were spent on banned substances and entertainment. At this time, Michael was under her complete control. They believed in a fictitious religion centered around Susan, who claimed she could see those possessed by demons, distinguish witches, sorcerers, and other dangerous entities. Meanwhile, Michael became a sort of instrument for executing witches. During this period, Lynn fought to obtain full custody of Jen. Lynn succeeded, but on weekends, Jen had to visit her father and stepmother. Jen found herself in a poorly organized home. She was only 4 years old at the time, later recalled entering the house to find it nearly empty, with many trees planted in pots throughout the interior. She described it as a kind of magic forest, as the house held little more than a single water bed for sleeping. From her later memories, weekends at her father's house felt like a horror movie. She did not like Susan, whom she described as a villain from a cartoon. It seemed that her father and stepmother were ignoring her existence. Jen instinctively felt that women should not eat, and later she discovered that she preferred to starve all weekend rather than eat the food offered to her. Despite the difficulties Jen faced, she initially did not tell her mother about the frightening real-life stories that haunted her. Instead, her memories from her early years were often filled with something terrifying. Jen remembered well that Susan considered her possessed by demons, punished her by scratching her back, while her father blindly believed everything his beloved Susan said and supported any punishment. Jen could do nothing to resist the much stronger adults. Susan repeatedly tried to conduct some kind of exorcism right on Jen, and during one of these sessions, Jen's body bore 5 marks resembling claw scars. When Lynn noticed these marks, she was alarmed and wondered what was happening in that house. She tried to ask Jen about it, but because of her young age, it was difficult for the girl to explain. Nevertheless, Lynn still sensed that something was wrong. It became clear to her that James's transformation into Michael was not an accidental event. In marriage, he had become much more aggressive. Lynn now believed that her daughter was in danger. Attempts to reach James were futile, as he was completely under Susan's influence. Contrary to the court's decision, Lynn took her daughter and ran away with her. Until that moment, they had lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and now they had moved to California. Lynn did not tell anyone their new address because she feared that if her actions were revealed, Jen would be taken away and that she would lose any opportunity to see her. She felt that Jen would not survive to enter school. Lynn did not want to contact law enforcement at all, knowing how slowly the system worked. Realizing that anything could happen during an investigation, she decided not to waste time. Lynn had to quit her job, and they lived very poorly after the escape, relying on random earnings. This escape became the second significant event in Jen's life. The first was the sudden divorce of her parents, which she never understood because her mother and father had once seemed to love each other. As she grew older, she supported Lynn's actions. Her mother explained that her father was sick, and they just needed to stay away from him to avoid being infected. In reality, James and Susan's way of life became eccentric, spending money on substances while neither worked. They decided to move to California, possibly because, during a moment of clarity, Michael wanted to reclaim his daughter, or maybe he thought things would be better there. They had no idea where they could find Jen and Lynn after moving. After days of wandering, Susan and Michael settled in San Francisco, where they met a girl named Karen Barnes, who was then 23 years old. Karen dreamed of becoming an actress and moved to California to try her luck in acting. Unfortunately, during this period, she met Susan and Michael, who willingly shared information about their cult. This unhealthy behavior intrigued her. The entire group ended up in a rented apartment since Susan and Michael could no longer afford housing. Karen became the first person to join this cult. She was attractive and immediately caught Michael's eye. However, he could not betray Susan behind her back. so he approached Karen openly and told her that he believed she should become his second wife. This proposition was unacceptable to Susan. She claimed to have seen the future and insisted that Karen was a witch who intended to destroy the cult and kill them both. Michael believed Susan so completely that he feared her power and obeyed her without question. Susan easily convinced him that he had to deal with Karen, making her the first victim of their cult. Michael agreed, waiting for Karen to arrive after taking a cast iron frying pan and a knife. On March 7, 1981, he hit Karen on the head to stun her and then stabbed her, inflicting 13 wounds to her face and neck in what seemed to be a ritual murder. They wrapped Karen's body in a blanket, placed her head on a pillow, and drew a series of strange symbols on the walls before leaving. Karen's dream of becoming an actress was shattered. When the door was broken down, her skull was discovered in a pool of blood, but no trace of the criminals was found, except for the drawings, which included the name Susan. The apartment had been rented by Karen, and aside from a superficial description from neighbors, there was no information about Michael and Susan. They fled, fully aware that they needed to distance themselves from the crime scene. They hitchhiked north and lived for a year in a secluded cabin in the wilderness, where no one could find them. Very little is known about this period in their lives. A year later, feeling bored, they discovered an illegal marijuana farm outside the city and decided to go there. It was quite a large illegal organization with a lot of work and a shortage of workers. Susan tended to the plants while Michael monitored the safety of the operation, and together they continued to live their typical hippie lifestyle, remaining constantly intoxicated from substances. A young man named Clark Stevens intervened in the matter. He was a 26-year-old guy, a friend of the plantation owner. Clark was well versed in growing illegal plants, but he drank a lot, and he had his own vision that contradicted Susan's opinion. Clark took the initiative, began giving advice. Susan did not like how actively Clark was interfering in their activities. It seemed as if he was too arrogant. She turned to her husband, declaring that this man was encroaching on the sacred, putting the profit of their religion below him, which was unacceptable. Susan told Michael that she had a vision in which Clark turned out to be an evil sorcerer. Naturally, this statement automatically became a death sentence for Clark. After Clark's murder, Michael obtained a gun. It is unknown where exactly it came from. In any case, he did not use it at first. He carried it with him to guard the farm. After Clark was dealt with, his body was doused with gasoline and burned. The remains were disposed of by burying them not far from this forbidden plantation in the forest. Later, the date of death was set as May 12, 1982. It is curious that this farm was located no more than a kilometer from residential buildings. In early summer of the same year, one of the families had an outdoor barbecue. They did not go deep into their yard but moved to the far part of a large plot of land. They had a large dog that they let run around. The animal went into the forest, as if attracted by something, and when it returned, the owners noticed something strange in its mouth. When the dog approached the married couple, they discovered it was carrying a part of a human skull. Naturally, the family called the police. Law enforcement officers discovered an illegal farm that had been abandoned in a hurry. No one was there, but a group of young people interviewed by the authorities told of a pair of dirty hippies who had fled the plantation quickly. They fled by hitchhiking again, disappearing into the territory of the states. On May 1983, the area around the plantation was thoroughly searched by a team that went deep into the forest, where they found Clark's burial place and a tourist backpack. Inside, they found various items, a pistol, a fake ID, and also a manifesto describing the program of a cult-like religious organization called Hunt. The most disturbing item was a list of names and surnames of so-called witches and sorcerers that included even popular figures such as Ronald Reagan, the current president of the United States, as well as the governor of the state. The police were particularly interested in two other names, Clark and Karen, who were already listed as killed. In total, the list contained 12 people, consisting of ordinary citizens. However, it turned out to be impossible to establish their fates precisely, as there was nothing specifying either addresses or phone numbers. Due to the possibility of a national security issue, the Federal Bureau of Investigation began a search. During this period of Jen's life, terrible changes began to occur. Her father, Michael, called Lynn and said that he was returning to California and intended to take Jen. Lynn did not give him the address. She was very scared because she could not even contact the police for protection. However, this did not even need to be done because just a few hours after Michael's call, FBI agents arrived at her home. The authorities already knew that Michael was actually James Carson, and Lynn was his ex-wife. Jen was the daughter whom the ex-wife had actually kidnapped. Despite this, they treated Lynn's act leniently, considering all the circumstances and the danger for Jen. The agents knew they were dealing with a very dangerous couple of criminals. In the father's desire to take Jen, they saw an opportunity to catch the killers. As far as the law enforcement officers knew at that time, Susan and Michael were hitchhiking, making it impossible to track their exact location. On May 12, 1983, in the car, a 30-year-old truck driver named John Hellier. A couple of young people who looked harmless were heading to California and picked up a other man. The only space in his car suitable for passengers was the cabin, but with 3 of them in the front, it was cramped. The hitchhikers began to settle inside when they climbed in. Michael saw this and was furious, as he perceived the contact of a mere mortal with the prophetess as a sign of disrespect. Susan supported his opinion. Michael took out other pistol, as the first one was thrown not far from the plantation. The cabin was cramped. John managed to start a fight. They fell out onto the road. Other motorists drove by, some even stopping to help, while Susan shouted to Michael that he had to finish off evil sorcerer. Realizing that a grown man could defeat her husband, Susan took a knife and approached John, stabbing the wounded driver. They run away, leaving John's body on the side of the highway in Napa County. Susan and Michael stole a truck and took off. However, witnesses reported to the police, which led to a big chase. Susan and Michael lost control and drove into a ditch. But they were not going to surrender. A shootout with the police began. The criminals managed to escape again, this time on foot. Susan and Michael then was miraculously detained after John's murder. No one was seriously hurt, and it was time for the villains to face fair punishment. Although there was evidence that they had victimized others on the list, they were not required to confess, particularly to the murders of Karen and Clark. They could only be charged with the murder of John, as there were witnesses and irrefutable evidence. When Susan and Michael were brought in for questioning, they refused to cooperate with the police, demanded the involvement of all TV channels, press, and newspapers. They sought to turn their bloody tale into a major press conference in order to gain fame. Susan insisted that she was a clairvoyant, claiming this would allow them to attract as many followers as she wanted, specifically targeting young people who were as devoted as Michael. Naturally, law enforcement agencies did not want to give such attention to them. As the trial approached, their demands for media involvement were partially met, but not to the extent that Susan had wanted. There were several reporters in the courtroom. Susan claimed that President Reagan was a demon who needed to be killed. Law enforcement managed to extract the names of 2 victims. And Michael confessed to killing Clark, who had worked with them on a plantation of prohibited plants. He also spoke about the failed actress, Karen. Before the trial even began, everything Susan and Michael said seemed like a circus. Susan expressed absurd ideas that were later quoted in various reports. Several books were written about her prophecies, but few people took her claims seriously. Among Susan's statements was the assertion that all these murders were committed in self-defense. She concluded her speech by expressing her bewilderment at why their fight against evil warranted any accusations. The forensic expert detailed the atrocities committed by Susan and Michael, making it obvious that their actions had nothing to do with self-defense or fighting demons. They themselves were pure evil. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 75 years for 3 counts of murder. It was clear that the killers should never have been released. It seemed that everything was over, but Jen's life turned into a nightmare. She accidentally learned the whole truth about her father and stepmother, which came with shocking details. Consequently, she found it impossible to trust anyone. Realizing that her own father, the man who had personally fed her breakfast every day and combed her hair, was capable of such terrible evil. She understood that evil was everywhere, impossible to escape. In her youth, she slept with scissors and a knife under her pillow, believing it the only way she could close her eyes and fall asleep. This fear eventually transformed into a fear that she herself could become a manifestation of pure evil, because the blood of murderer ran in her veins. Thoughts of what her father had done haunted her relentlessly. At the age of 10, Jen even considered taking her own life. During that difficult time, she was actively supported by her mother, stepfather, and teachers. These close figures helped her resist despair, and she chose to embrace life. As a teenager, Jen dated various guys but found it hard to hide the truth about her father. Many learned who he was and subsequently broke up with her. Eventually, Jen concocted a story that he had died in a car accident, yet the truth became unbearable over time, prompting her to confess. Ultimately, she realized she had to confront her fear head-on. At the age of 20, Jen visited prison for the first time in years to see her father. During all this time, he had sent her letters every week, but their content was bizarre. When they finally met, she did not even use the transparent barrier and phone but met him in person. Her father hugged her, and she felt choked with horror as he told absurd stories about the fortune teller Susan. Speaking as though he had last seen her only yesterday, he was completely unaware that he had been locked away for the last 15 years. As she left the visit, she realized he had not changed a bit, nor did he feel guilty. The father who had loved her simply no longer existed. After this encounter, Jen contacted the families of Michael Carson's victims and apologized on his behalf. They all responded in the same way: she was not guilty and should not suffer for her father's crimes. After this, she began to manage her traumas, but her nightmares were far from over. In 2014, a reform of the correctional system was enacted, enabling Susan and Michael to request parole every 5 years. Jen's nightmares returned once again when Michael applied for parole for the first time. Jen was on the commission, but contrary to her previous stance, she argued that he was dangerous and did not regret the crimes he committed. She insisted that if he were released, he would kill again. The next attempt for parole took place in May 2020, but James was again refused. The court ruled that he would have the next opportunity no earlier than 10 years from then, which means in May 2030, when he turns 74, he will try to get out again. The situation with Susan was somewhat different. She also applied for parole in 2015, but her request was denied. The court ruled that she would not be eligible for another opportunity for 15 years. A lawyer took up her case, believing that this was too long a period. In 2023, the defense attorney's appeal was approved, so in December 2025, another hearing will be held, and Susan will have the right to seek parole. The families of the victims of these criminals, along with Jen Carson, are waiting with bated breath for this moment, praying that the commission will make a negative decision. Jen and her mother, Lynn, are still convinced that the real number of the killer's victims is much higher than 3. Determined to make a difference, Jen decided to devote her life to helping people, particularly those who are contemplating self-harm. For this purpose, she received a doctorate in social work. Now, while helping others, she has found peace. Jen understands that she cannot atone for her father's sins nor bring innocent victims back to life. She can only live her life in a way that brings as much light to the world as possible, and she is committed to doing this. Welcome back, mystery lovers. Today's case is going to keep you on the edge of your seat. The case of the Watts family. Shannon Razusek, 34, and her husband, Christopher, 33, have 2 daughters, Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3. Both are from North Carolina and met on Facebook. Initially, she did not accept her proposal. When Shannon faced difficulties in her life, Christopher supported her, and their relationship began to grow rapidly from that point. They relocated to Frederick, Colorado, where they got married on November 3, 2012, and decided to start a family despite facing challenges. At that time, Shannon was informed that she might not be able to have children due to her lupus diagnosis, an autoimmune disease. Nevertheless, Christopher reassured her of his unwavering support and encouraged her to accept his marriage proposal. Despite her health issues, Shannon joyfully became a mother and gave birth to 2 beloved daughters, whom she described as amazing and spirited. Shannon then discovered she was pregnant with a baby boy. This news filled her with excitement, knowing how Christopher had always dreamed of having a son. She was thrilled to fulfill his wish and expand their family, and her daughters were also excited about welcoming a new sibling. They even chose a name for the baby, Nico. Shannon was very active on social media, frequently posting updates about her life on Instagram. She shared videos about herself and her children, showcasing family moments, and engaging with various online communities. To outsiders, it appeared that the family led a perfect life. Christopher worked for a large oil and natural gas company, while Shannon previously worked in human resources at a children's hospital. However, her husband's income was not sufficient to cover their living expenses and the mortgage on their large 5-bedroom home with a 3-car garage. As a result, they filed for bankruptcy in 2015 due to high mortgage payments, health insurance costs, and medical expenses. Soon after, Shannon started a new job at an online supplement company. She loved the job because it offered many benefits. She could spend all day with her children and have quality time with them, while also having the opportunity to travel for work with a high salary, which suited her very well. On June 16, 2018, she shared a heartfelt post on social media about her life, expressing her happiness and satisfaction with her new job. In her post, she mentioned that she loved the lifestyle that allowed her to live fully and cherish every moment with her family. Shannon often expressed her happiness and painted a picture of a thriving, successful, and friendly family on social media. During a live session, she mentioned that she had many upcoming plans and trips. From June 22 to 26, she was scheduled to travel to San Diego with Christopher. After that trip, she planned to take their daughters to North Carolina to visit relatives, returning home on August 7th. She was also looking forward to a short business trip for work that would last just a couple of nights. She shared her plans and cheerful posts on social media. After attending a seminar in Arizona, she returned home on August 13, 2018. Her close friend, Nicola Toft Atkinson, picked her up from the airport and dropped her off around 2 a.m. This was the last time anyone saw Shannon alive. A friend later noted that Shannon appeared very tired and exhausted, as if she hadn't been sleeping well, but she seemed determined. It looked like she was preparing for something at home, where her husband Christopher and their 2 daughters were waiting for her. On August 13th, Shannon had an appointment for a checkup regarding her 3rd pregnancy, which was in its 15th week. The doctor's visit was necessary to ensure that everything was progressing normally. However, when she failed to arrive for her 10 a.m. appointment and missed a business meeting, her friend Nicole became concerned. Nicole found it unusual that Shannon wasn't answering her phone or responding to text messages, especially since Shannon typically took her communication seriously because of her job and her responsibilities as a mother. Worried about Shannon, Nicole tried to call her throughout the day. When that didn't work, Nicole decided to check on her at her house. Upon arriving, Nicole noticed her car in the driveway and knocked on the door, but no one responded. Next, Nicole called her husband, Christopher, who was at work, and then contacted the police. The police arrived at 1:40 p.m. and attempted to get a response by knocking on the door, but when that failed, the officer contacted Christopher and suggested he come to help check the house. When Christopher arrived, he entered the house with a police officer. They found Shannon's mobile phone on the sofa, between the pillows, while in the kitchen, her handbag, wallet, and keys were located. A suitcase filled with belongings was near the stairs. All of Shannon's personal items, including her daughter's medicine, were inside the house, indicating that she had not left. Her car was parked as usual, and the child's seats were still in place. Only Shannon and her daughters, Bella and Celeste, were the ones missing. In missing persons investigations, authorities typically start by questioning the partner or spouse of the missing individual, asking if they have noticed anything unusual, have any information, when they last saw them, or if there was any conflict. This case followed the same protocol, and Christopher was asked such questions. He informed the police that Shannon returned home around 2 a.m., and during an emotional conversation, he told her he wanted a divorce. Both were upset and crying. Afterwards, he went to work. He never saw Shannon again. Surveillance footage from a nearby house confirmed that he left at 5:15 a.m., and no one else exited the house after that, prompting the police to call in a detective. Christopher informed the detective that the timeline of the incident began when Shannon returned home at 1:48 a.m. They had a conversation at 4 a.m., and he left for work at 5:15 a.m. Initially, he claimed that he and his wife had an emotional discussion upon her arrival, which was a minor inconsistency in his story. Over the next 2 days, Christopher gave several interviews to the media about the disappearance of his wife and children, trying to present himself as a genuinely worried father. He stated that his children were his life and that their smiles lit up his world, expressing his sorrow over their absence. That image, however, didn't last long. On August 15, 2018, Christopher was arrested on 3 counts of first-degree murder. He had previously failed a lie detector test, and during a later interrogation, he confessed to killing his wife, but denied any involvement in their daughter's death. Investigators also examined the neighbor's video footage, which showed Christopher loading a large, heavy object wrapped in a sheet into his car at 5:30 a.m. on August 13. Notably, there was no video evidence of Shannon leaving the house. This lack of footage led the police to conclude that Christopher was loading the bodies of Shannon and their daughters into the vehicle. Before he fully confessed, he requested to see his father. When his father entered the interrogation room, he shared his account of the incident, shocking everyone present, as no one anticipated what he would say. Christopher shared that he and Shannon had a deeply emotional conversation in which he acknowledged their marriage was failing. Just before leaving for work, he glanced at the baby monitor and saw Shannon attempting to strangle their daughter Celeste by the crib. He immediately rushed to the room and found Bella bruised and, unfortunately, dead. Witnessing Shannon harm their children drove Christopher into a fury, and in a fit of rage, he strangled his wife in a similar manner. Christopher mentioned that after discussing divorce, Shannon threatened that he would never see their daughters again, seemingly indicating she was about to act on her intentions. Following his confession, Christopher revealed to the authorities where he had hidden the bodies, guiding them to the site near his workplace, where oil tanks were located. Shannon was buried in a shallow grave about 40 miles from their home, while their daughter was placed in the oil tanks, submerged in crude oil. He explained that the tragedy arose because he and his wife had drifted apart, focusing on their children but neglecting their relationship. However, a significant detail later emerged that changed the narrative. Christopher had been having an affair with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, which began while Shannon and their daughter were visiting relatives in North Carolina. Nicole was a contractor at Christopher's workplace, where they met and quickly entered into a relationship. He told her that he and Shannon had mutually agreed to divorce and mentioned that they had 2 daughters, but he did not disclose that Shannon was pregnant with their 3rd child. Later, Nicole mentioned that if she had known about the pregnancy, she would never have spent time with Christopher. Although their relationship was new, it progressed quickly, and Nicole was already planning to marry him. The day before Shannon and her daughter went missing, Nicole had been shopping for a wedding dress. When Shannon and the kids' disappearance captured public attention, Nicole went to the police to disclose her affair with Christopher. She revealed that she had visited Christopher's family home twice at the beginning of their relationship, but her visits were brief. Nicole also believed that financial issues were a motive behind Christopher's actions. She recounted that on the night Shannon was reported missing, she called Christopher and found him in bed, getting ready to sleep. He claimed that his wife was missing, likely because she intended to leave him and take the kids with her. Nicole found it odd that he could sleep calmly under such circumstances. Realizing something was definitely amiss, Nicole decided to inform the police and cooperated fully with their investigation. The authorities suspected Nicole's involvement in the murders, but they lacked evidence to support their claims. It later emerged that Christopher and Shannon had experienced disagreements and emotional distance in recent months, leading Shannon to take an extended vacation with their children to reflect and give her husband space to think. However, Despite her cheerful social media posts, her messages to Christopher revealed that their relationship was strained. On August 5, 2018, Shannon wrote to Christopher that she was trying to give him space, but while he was working, he was living like a bachelor. She mentioned that she was at home with their third child, managing their two other kids every day, working, and trying to earn money. She said it was hard for him to even send a text saying that he loved her and missed her, and she kept checking her phone, hoping to hear from him. In her letter, she expressed her disbelief that it had been 8 years since they started dating and mentioned that they now had 3 kids. She indicated that they needed to talk. The letter conveyed her feelings of missing him and loving him, emphasizing the importance of working on their marriage. However, she also mentioned that if their feelings for each other didn't align, it would be necessary to discuss it. Shannon remarked that she couldn't understand how someone could fall out of love during the 5 weeks she had been away. Christopher stated that he loved Shannon and was with her not just for the children, but he struggled to understand his own feelings. Shannon later confided in a friend that their relationship had faced many challenges and that they had become incompatible, particularly because Christopher refused to attend couples counseling. During the investigation, prosecutors realized that Christopher desired a new romantic relationship and a fresh start, wanting to escape the burdens of family life and the tensions in his marriage. He was even looking for a new apartment with Nicole. After committing the crime, Christopher was not only focused on finding a new apartment but also hurriedly listed his house for sale. On August 21, 2018, Christopher was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts related to the murder of a child under 12, 1 count of illegal termination of pregnancy, and 3 counts of abuse of a corpse. To avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to all charges in 2018. On November 19, he was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole, receiving an additional 48 years for illegal termination of pregnancy and 36 years for abuse of a corpse. 2 months after the verdict was announced, Christopher disclosed the truth about the incident. He explained that he had not loved Shannon for a long time but was afraid to leave her because he thought she would take their daughters. He met Nicole at work and was the first to approach her, claiming that he was already in the process of divorcing his wife and did not wear a wedding ring. During an argument, Christopher strangled Shannon in their bedroom. The autopsy indicated that she had suffered for a while, suggesting that she had tried to fight back. At that moment, their older daughter, Bella, walked in and asked what was happening. Christopher told her that her mother was sick and needed to rest. He then wrapped Shannon's body in a sheet and carried it to the car. When their daughter began to cry, scared and confused, Christopher lost control and strangled both of them, Celeste with her own blanket and Bella with his hands. He heard Bella's last words, "Dad, no," as she fought for her life. Christopher then disposed of the bodies by taking them to the oil site where he worked, burying Shannon and throwing his daughter's bodies into oil tanks. After the verdict, Christopher Watts was sent to state prison but was later transferred for safety reasons to a maximum security facility in Wisconsin, where he will spend the rest of his life. The judge who sentenced Christopher described the murders as some of the most inhumane and cruel acts that he had ever encountered in his career. Shannon's father labeled Christopher a heartless monster and expressed a wish that the souls of his daughters haunt Christopher at night. He emphasized that Christopher deserves to suffer. So again, true crime fans, we've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Valerie Pride. Valerie Pride was born on March 9, 1958, and grew up in Arizona with her 5 brothers and 1 sister, which contributed to her strong and determined character. She attended South Mountain High School, where she gained a reputation for her intelligence and ambition. After graduating, she aimed to continue her education at Arizona State University, driven to create a better future for herself. During her high school years, Valerie fell in love with a young man named Jimmy Pride. Their romance flourished, and in 1974, they got married. Just a year later, they welcomed their first daughter, Shansha. In 1977, their family expanded again with the birth of their second daughter, Duana. Despite being a young mother, Valerie continued to pursue her ambitions. She aspired to become an electrician, a profession that was predominantly male at the time, and she did not let anything stand in her way. By the time Duana was born, Valerie had been accepted into a job training program sponsored by the United Electrical Workers, a rare and competitive opportunity. She made history by becoming the first black female electrician at the Palo Verde nuclear plant, all while caring for her 2 young children. Her life was a delicate balance of motherhood, work, and being a trailblazer in her industry. However, Valerie faced challenges in her personal life as well. Her marriage to Jimmy eventually ended in divorce. Even so, she remained strong, focusing on her career and her children, and trying to give them the best life possible. After the divorce, Valerie found new love with Ben Daniels, a co-worker at the nuclear power plant. Ben also had children from a previous marriage, and as their relationship deepened, they began planning for their future together. Although they appear perfect on the outside, their relationship is actually unstable. Valerie's sister, Vicki McDonald, revealed that Ben's past was negatively affecting their relationship. Vicki mentioned that Ben would often reassure Valerie that he had everything under control. Despite these issues, Valerie maintained her faith in Ben and their future, and before long, the two took a big step forward in their relationship together. In 1982, Valerie and Ben decided to purchase a new home in a quiet area of South Phoenix, Arizona. This marked a significant milestone in their lives. They selected a newly constructed Spanish-style home, imagining it as a place for a new beginning. Meanwhile, Valerie was finishing her final year of training to become an electrician, nearing a career breakthrough. After her divorce, she had found love again, and now they had a new home to create memories with their daughters. Everything seemed to be going very well. Sometimes, life's most promising moments can disappear in an instant. Just weeks after moving into their new home, tragedy struck unexpectedly. Labor Day weekend in 1982 began like any other for Valerie and her daughters. It was meant to be a time for relaxation, family bonding, and simple pleasures. But on Monday, September 6th, what started as a normal day turned horrific. At around 4 p.m., Ben received a call that no parent ever wants to hear. His 9-year-old daughter from a previous relationship had had an epileptic seizure while bathing. Her mother was with her but had stepped out for a minute. In that short time, the little girl suffered a seizure and submerged underwater. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors battled to save her, but by the time Ben arrived, it was too late. His daughter had been pronounced dead. While Ben was at the hospital dealing with an unimaginable loss, Valerie and her daughters were at home, completely unaware of the situation. In a time before cell phones, Valerie had no quick way to contact Ben or find out what was happening, so she had to wait for him to call her. Around 9:30 that evening, Valerie spoke on the phone with Ben's brother. This call became her last known contact with anyone outside her home. They spoke for about 10 minutes, focusing on the condition of Ben's daughter in the hospital. During the conversation, there was a knock on the front door of Valerie's house. She informed Ben's brother that she needed to hang up to answer the door, as Ben was not home. That was the last time anyone heard from her. Neither she nor Ben's brother realized that this would be their final conversation. At around 10 p.m., after several hours in the hospital, Ben returned home, exhausted and grieving the loss of his daughter. He just wanted to get some rest. However, as he neared his house, he noticed something was wrong. The front door was slightly ajar, which was unusual, especially in the Arizona summer when everyone kept their doors closed to maintain cool air indoors. Ben carefully pushed the door open and stepped inside, where he saw a horrifying sight: blood everywhere. Valerie and her 2 daughters, Shansha and Duana, had been murdered. They had been brutally attacked in the living room, just a few feet apart. 8-year-old Shantia and 4-year-old Duana lay lifeless in the living room, their small bodies covered in blood. Valerie was also found dead near the kitchen, her body soaked in blood. The home they had just moved into, where they hoped to start anew, had turned into a scene of unimaginable violence. Ben's screams echoed through the night. Overwhelmed with grief, he collapsed, crying out so loudly that neighbors rushed outside to see what was happening. Unable to help, the neighbors called the police, as Ben was too devastated to do anything but mourn. For any parent, losing a child is an indescribable pain, but returning home to find one's entire family slaughtered is simply beyond comprehension. When the police arrived, even the most experienced officers struggled to comprehend the scene before them. Many described it as the most horrific crime scene they had ever encountered. Blood was everywhere, covering the floors and walls. Shansha and Duana were discovered huddled together in the living room near a love seat, still in their pajamas, which suggested that they were preparing for bed when the attack occurred. Valerie was found in the dining area close to the kitchen, her body just a few feet from the back door, as if she had been trying to escape. There were no signs of forced entry at the crime scene, indicating that the killer either had permission to enter or managed to get in without breaking anything. The police began to consider a disturbing possibility when they learned about a knock at the door during Valerie's last phone call. The person who knocked might have been the one responsible for the horrific crime. Furthermore, it was revealed that the suspect had not stayed in the house after the murders. They exited through the back door and jumped over the fence, vanishing into the night. The murders were initially believed to be the result of a robbery gone wrong, but that theory was quickly dismissed. There were no signs of forced entry, no stolen items, and no evidence of an intruder. Instead, they discovered a scene of shocking violence. Someone had entered the home with the singular purpose of committing murder. The pressing question for investigators was, who would want to kill a young mother and her children in such a brutal manner? Time was critical, as a dangerous killer was still on the loose, and they needed to apprehend him before he could strike again. That night, the neighborhood was quiet, but one person had noticed something unusual. As police officers searched the area, a neighbor mentioned hearing a loud argument coming from Valerie's home around 9:45 p.m., but thought it was just a typical family disagreement. When they looked outside, they saw nothing, no suspicious individuals, no signs of trouble, and nothing that seemed alarming. An hour later, at 11 p.m., Valerie's ex-husband, Jimmy Pride, arrived at the house. When the officers informed him that his daughters had been murdered, he collapsed on the pavement, screaming in anguish, just like Ben had. He couldn't contain his emotions, writhing in pain and sobbing. The anguish was so intense that the police had to intervene by force to calm him down. Meanwhile, behind the house, there was a bloody handprint on the wooden fence. This was clear evidence that the murderer had escaped by climbing over the fence and disappearing into the darkness, likely through the yard of a nearby abandoned home. But whose handprint was it, and what kind of person could commit such a brutal act? The investigation took a more disturbing turn when detectives learned that Valerie's family had only recently moved into the neighborhood. They had been there for just a few weeks, barely enough time to make friends, let alone enemies. No one truly knew them, yet someone wanted them dead. Detectives searched for answers by examining Valerie's life. They investigated her social relationships, her family, and sought any signs of a possible enemy. However, as they delved deeper, the truth became increasingly troubling. There was nothing to uncover. Valerie had no history of conflict, no long-standing grudges, and no background suggesting that she would meet a violent end. She was a devoted mother and lived an ordinary life. Yet, someone had violently disrupted that life in a horrific manner. Autopsies revealed that both Valerie and her two daughters, Shansha and Duana, had been attacked multiple times. Notably, there was no evidence of abuse, which eliminated one possible motive, but it did not bring them any closer to solving the case. With each passing day, the investigation stalled, unanswered questions continued to accumulate, and the town was left in a state of fear. On September 10, 1982, Valerie and her daughters were buried, but their funerals were filled with tension. The community was haunted by the reality that a killer remained at large. Detectives then discovered an unusual clue. A month before the murders, Valerie and Ben's home had been broken into. Initially, it appeared to be a simple burglary, but the details were alarming. The intruder rummaged through the house and also slashed their waterbed. Disturbingly, they took Valerie's clothes and tossed them into the water, indicating a personal motive. It was clear that this was not a simple thief looking for valuables, but rather an enemy who wanted to send a message. Could this have been a threat? Did Valerie unknowingly encounter someone dangerous? Investigators were eager to find connections, but the case hit another dead end. the culprit had disappeared without a trace. As months went by, what seemed like promising leads faded away. Numerous tips came in, each one offering the possibility of a breakthrough, but none brought the detectives any closer to solving the case. What once felt urgent was now growing cold. As the situation became tense, rumors began to spread throughout the town, accompanied by various theories, such as ghosts in the night. One particularly chilling theory suggested that the recent murders were linked to the tragic death of Ben's daughter. Some residents speculated that Valerie and her daughters were murdered as a twisted form of revenge. Ben's 9-year-old daughter had died in an accident, leading some to believe that someone held Valerie responsible for it. However, investigators later clarified that the girl had suffered an epileptic seizure and had drowned, with the autopsy confirming that there was no foul play involved. Despite this, rumors continued to thrive, contributing to the growing anxiety in the town. As the 1-year anniversary of the murders approaches, detectives have not yet found any new leads. The murders of Valerie and her daughters shocked the community, and investigators are still searching for information, but to no avail. Valerie's union and the Silent Witness program have offered a $2,000 reward, yet no significant evidence has been uncovered so far. In August 1983, the case took an unexpected turn. Police announced that a suspect had been arrested, and the news quickly spread throughout the town, raising hopes that justice would be served. What surprised everyone, however, was that the suspect was only 14 years old and still a high school student. Authorities also disclosed that they were searching for 2 other suspects, one juvenile and one adult, believed to be involved in the murders. The police suspected that the murder might have been an act of revenge for the death of Ben's daughter, a theory that had been discussed but never confirmed. The arrested teenager was believed to be related to Ben's daughter. Could Valerie have been blamed for the child's death? Was there a deep-seated resentment that led to something violent? This idea was frightening, but it raised more questions than it answered. If Ben's daughter's death was considered an accident, why would anyone blame Valerie for it? And if the motive was revenge, why target her daughters as well? It was confusing, and even the investigators were skeptical. Just when it seemed that a motive had been identified, the case became more complicated. Within 24 hours of the arrest, the 14-year-old was released. The district attorney decided not to file charges, stating that more investigation was necessary. The evidence the detectives had was not strong enough to support a case in court. 2 other potential suspects were never arrested, no charges, no answers. The case, which had briefly reignited interest, went cold again. 2 years later, a neighbor found a surprising clue, a knife buried in a backyard. It closely resembled the one thought to have been used in the murders. Investigators quickly sent it to the crime lab, hoping it might finally provide a breakthrough. But once again, optimism turned into disappointment. The knife was tested for DNA, but there were no matches, no evidence linking it to Valerie, Shansha, or Duana. It was yet another dead end in a case that continued to be a mystery. As the years passed, the detectives never gave up on the case. They meticulously reviewed every piece of evidence, interviewed over 1,000 people, and followed every lead, but they still couldn't identify the killer or their motive. By 2012, investigators admitted that they had exhausted all possibilities and needed the public's help, believing that someone had vital information. They were convinced that this was a deeply personal crime. The perpetrator had entered Valerie's family home with the sole intention of committing murder. Now, more than 40 years later, the case remains unsolved. The brutal murders of Valerie, Shansha, and Duana continue to haunt the community, leaving an emotional scar that won't heal. Investigators think that someone close to Valerie might hold the key to the truth. But how could someone capable of such brutality carry on as if nothing had happened? Do they feel remorse? Do they ever worry about being caught? Or have they convinced themselves that they got away with murder? In recent years, advancements in forensic technology have allowed detectives to revisit the evidence. DNA collected from the crime scene has been submitted to a national database, raising hopes for a breakthrough. However, even if the killer is eventually identified, no explanation will ever make sense. Nothing can justify the horrific act of killing an innocent mother and her 2 young daughters. This crime epitomizes senseless violence. Valerie, Shansha, and Duana did not deserve what happened to them. Regardless of how much time has passed, one thing is clear: those capable of such a terrible act must be held accountable. Valerie Pride's life was a testament to resilience, ambition, and a profound love for her two daughters, Shansha and Duana. She was determined to pursue a stellar career as the first black electrician at the Palo Verde nuclear power plant and to build a new life with Ben Daniels in South Phoenix. However, on Labor Day weekend in 1982, her family's dreams and future were brutally snatched away in a horrific act of violence. More than 40 years later, the mystery of who killed them and why remains unsolved, leaving a lasting pain in the community. Despite advances in forensic science, nothing can erase the tragedy that claimed the lives of an innocent mother and her two young daughters. This man was convicted of slaughtering 7 individuals, including his own children. He still had the audacity to blow a kiss at the camera, as if nothing had happened. That eerie moment alone cements him as one of the most cold-blooded mass murderers in New Zealand's history, and his name is Raymond Wahia Radama, a man whose actions shook the peaceful town of Masterton, where people had believed they were safe. At that time, Masterton was a small, close-knit community celebrated for its rural charm. Situated in the Wairarapa region, the town was encircled by green farmland and rolling hills, creating a serene landscape. The local economy primarily relied on agriculture, particularly sheep farming, which was a leading industry. Many residents were employed in farming or related sectors, such as wool processing, small manufacturing, and retail. Life there moved at a slow and predictable pace. Violent crime was uncommon. Beneath the seemingly pleasant exterior, however, economic difficulties were beginning to emerge. In the early 1990s, New Zealand was dealing with the consequences of economic reforms from the previous decade. Many families, especially those in working-class areas like Masterton, were feeling the strain of increasing unemployment and financial insecurity. Job opportunities were limited, wages were low, and support from welfare programs was often insufficient. For someone like Radama, who was already struggling to support his family, these challenges only heightened his frustration and desperation. At 25, Radama and his wife, Toni, were overwhelmed by financial stress, making it difficult to keep up with rising rent costs. With 3 young children to care for, they had to move in with Toni's parents on Judd Street in Masterton. Living with extended family was challenging, the house was cramped, tensions were high. Arguments became more common, emotions flared, and resentment grew. Over the months, his frustration intensified, driven not only by financial difficulties but also by a sense of powerlessness and rejection as he watched his life fall apart. He sought help from social services in hopes of finding support and a way to recover, but the assistance he needed never materialized. Left alone with his despair, his feelings transformed into a deep, violent rage. By June, Radama's marriage had completely collapsed. A serious conflict involving Radama, his wife, and her family marked the final breaking point. He was expelled from their home, feeling rejected and isolated, with nowhere to turn for help. As he struggled with insomnia, wandered alone, consumed by anger and hopelessness, he reached a terrifying conclusion: if he couldn't have his family, then no one else would. On the night of June 26, 1992, Toni went out to meet her parents, Philip and Tubby Ferguson, at a local pub, leaving her 3 young sons, Karipi, Barney, and Stacy, with her sister, Nicola, 20. Also present in the house were Toni's brother, Philip Ferguson Jr., 14, Mikola's partner, Bevan Tepu, 21, and their young son, Stephen, 3. That night, Raymond Radama returned home armed with a knife and a softball bat. He violently attacked everyone inside, killing 7 people through stabbing and bludgeoning. Tragically, his own children were among the victims. In a disturbing move, he placed their bodies on his wife's bed and covered them with a Bible, as if seeking forgiveness. The bodies of the adults were also piled together in another bedroom, creating a horrifying scene that was difficult to comprehend. But Radama's bloodlust was not yet satisfied. He sat in the house, waiting for Toni and her parents to return so he could finish what he had started. When they finally walked through the door, the nightmare continued. Nicola's father, Philip, was the first to be attacked. Radama swung the softball bat with full force, striking him in a brutal assault. This time, however, things did not go according to plan. In the chaos, Tony managed to escape, running for her life to call for help. When the police arrived, the carnage they witnessed would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Blood soaked the floors, and lifeless bodies filled the rooms. In the midst of it all was Raymond Radama, subdued, and he was no longer in control. Tony's father, Philip, had overpowered him, preventing a greater tragedy. The news of the massacre spread like wildfire. New Zealand had never seen such a horrifying crime. A father, a husband, a son-in-law, someone who was supposed to protect his family, had instead wiped them out in cold blood. The community of Masterton was left reeling, struggling to understand how something so monstrous could have happened in their quiet town. Radama was arrested at the scene and taken into custody. His initial demeanor was eerily calm, as if he had accepted his fate. He offered little resistance, making no attempt to flee. During questioning, he showed minimal emotion, providing cold, matter-of-fact responses. Investigators were disturbed by his apparent lack of remorse. When Radama stood trial in 1993, the nation watched in shock. He expressed remorse, but the sheer brutality of his crimes left many wondering if it was genuine or merely an attempt to save himself from the harshest punishment. During the trial, the prosecution painted a picture of a man who had allowed his rage and feelings of inadequacy to fester for too long. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Radama had been pushed to his breaking point due to financial strain and rejection by his wife's family. Mental health professionals were brought in to assess his state of mind, but ultimately, the jury saw through any justifications. The judge described the killings as unimaginable. Radama was sentenced to life imprisonment for 7 counts of murder. Additionally, he was given 10 years for the killing of an unborn child and another 7 years for attempted murder. Even behind bars, the horror of what he had done did not fade. The parole board repeatedly denied his bids for release, citing his continued struggles with banned substance abuse. In 2008, the board noted that despite presenting himself as a reformed man in previous hearings, Radama had relapsed into cannabis use, blaming his actions on a dark day in his past. Year after year, Radama has stood before the parole board pleading for his release. He insists that he has changed, that he has grown, and that he is no longer the man he was when he committed those horrific crimes. Yet, each time, the board has denied his requests, stating the same concerns: his psychological state, his risk to society, and his lack of true remorse. It has now been more than 30 years since Radama was sentenced, and despite numerous parole hearings, the board remains unconvinced that he is fit to re-enter the world outside prison walls. Radama has been denied parole not just once or twice, but a total of 14 times. His repeated attempts to gain freedom have been met with the same result. His lawyer, Roger Eagles, has now taken a different approach, claiming that there is potential bias in the parole process. Eagles argues that one of the parole board members, Professor Phil Brynd, had previously prepared psychological reports on Radama in 1992, and his involvement in the current parole decisions could create an unfair assessment. He points out that Brynd is the only person on the board who has had extensive personal interaction with Radama, which could lead to preconceived judgments rather than an objective evaluation of Radama's progress over the past 3 decades. The legal challenge does not stop there. Eagles has also argued that Radama's repeated parole denials are evidence of bias. He claims that despite Radama undergoing rehabilitation programs and counseling, the board has never granted him a single opportunity for conditional release, raising concerns about whether he is being treated unfairly compared to other prisoners with similar convictions. However, the parole board has maintained its stance, insisting that every hearing is based on up-to-date psychological evaluations and risk assessments rather than relying on reports from the past. They argue that Radama's continued imprisonment is not the result of bias but rather the outcome of his failure to meet the necessary criteria for release. Another point of contention in Radama's case is the way his parole hearings have been conducted. Eagles has argued that previous hearings have gone off track, with the board focusing too much on questioning Radama about his motivations for the crimes and the impact on his victims. He claims that the discussions have shifted from evaluating whether Radama is fit for release to revisiting his past, which should not be the central focus of the hearings. Eagles contends that while it is understandable for the board to consider the severity of Radama's crimes, parole decisions should be based on his rehabilitation and risk factors in the present, rather than continuously re-examining the past. In 2021, it was revealed that Radama had begun a relationship with a woman who had suffered childhood trauma. The board expressed concerns about this relationship, fearing that it could trigger another violent episode given Radama's history and the emotional volatility that played a role in his past actions. The board was deeply troubled by this revelation and questioned whether Radama was capable of forming healthy relationships, or if this new connection was a sign of unresolved psychological issues. Despite attending nearly 100 sessions with a psychologist, board members still believed Radama lacked insight into his crimes, which made them skeptical of his ability to maintain a stable and responsible relationship outside of prison. The concern was not just about Radama himself, but also about the potential harm that could come to his partner if he were released without proper safeguards in place. During one of his parole hearings, Radama made a statement that only reinforced the board's concerns. He claimed that he had loved his children and believed he was putting them in a better place by taking their lives. This statement sent chills down the spines of the parole board members, as it suggested that Radama still harbored a distorted sense of justification for his actions, rather than fully accepting the gravity of his crimes. His words implied that he had once rationalized these actions as an act of mercy. The board saw this as a major red flag, indicating that Radama had not yet reached a true understanding of his past actions or the level of self-awareness and accountability required for parole consideration. Despite these concerns, reports from inside the prison indicate that Radama has generally maintained good behavior. He has been described as respectful within the prison environment, and there have been positive reports about his work while incarcerated. Additionally, corrections officials have stated that there is no further need for additional rehabilitation programs, as Radama has already completed the necessary courses. However, even with these positive notes, the parole board has remained firm in its decision to keep him behind bars, stating that good behavior in a controlled environment does not necessarily translate to safe behavior in the outside world. In his most recent parole hearing in 2024, Radama made a significant admission. For the first time in over 3 decades, he acknowledged that the killings were intentional. This directly contradicted his previous claims. While this confession marked a departure from his earlier statements, it still failed to provide clarity on the most crucial question: why? Despite finally admitting his intent, Radama refused to explain his motives. During the hearing, he expressed deep regret, stating, "I was a very selfish man for what I did. All I can say is that I really regret wholeheartedly the decision that I made in order to kill all those many children and adults. I hate myself for what I've done." However, the parole board remained skeptical. They pointed out that his changing narrative over the years only raised further concerns about his credibility. Given his history of inconsistent explanations, the board questioned whether this newfound admission was genuine or simply another attempt to manipulate the system in his favor. The victims' families continue to oppose his release, maintaining that Radama has never fully explained his actions or shown true remorse to them. His admissions mean little without an honest, clear acknowledgement of why he did what he did. Many still believe that Radama poses a danger to society and should never be granted parole. In response to these concerns, the board recommended that Radama be transferred to a special treatment unit for violent offenders. However, he resisted the move, arguing that it would be a step backward in his rehabilitation rather than a constructive measure. Despite his efforts, the parole board once again denied Radama's release. The ruling made it clear that while his latest statement represented a shift, it was not enough to justify granting him freedom. The board emphasized that public safety remained their top priority and that Radama's risk factors had not diminished to a satisfactory level. For now, Raymond Wayne Radama remains in prison, and his next parole eligibility will come in April 2025. Whether he will finally succeed in persuading the board remains uncertain. However, given his long history of denied applications, changing statements, and ongoing concerns from the victims' families, his path to release remains as difficult as ever. On a quiet Saturday evening in West Hollywood, an awful incident occurred inside an apartment just a few blocks from the busy city streets. Despite the calmness, no unusual sounds, no loud arguments or cries for help, but behind that door, a disagreement escalated into a serious situation. When police and firefighters finally entered the apartment, they were stunned by what they found, even experienced officers. What really happened that night? Kirtland Ma was born on December 24, 1979, in Scottsdale, Arizona, in the eastern part of Maricopa County. He was the youngest of two sons of Danny and Peggy Ma, a Chinese-American couple. Kirtland grew up in a loving and peaceful environment. He was a deeply cherished child, especially by his maternal grandparents, Wing Doi Jimmy and Ellen Lee. With his friendly demeanor and constant smile, he had a natural charm that endeared him to everyone, making his grandparents feel incredibly fortunate to have him as their grandson. Kirtland showed early academic potential in elementary school, but it was in high school that his passion for learning really blossomed. He was not only a talented student but also had a strong curiosity that drove him to seek knowledge beyond what was taught in classes. After regular school hours, he took advanced mathematics courses at another institution, aiming to push himself further. One day, while heading to one of these extra classes, he met a girl his age from a different school. Their brief conversation left a lasting impression. She was drawn to Kirtland's kindness and sense of humor, and he felt the same way. From that point on, they became very close. During their junior year, they both transferred to the same school in Phoenix. Soon after, she worked up the courage to confess her feelings for Kirtland, believing he was her soulmate. She shared her deep love for him, but Kirtland, although considerate, did not feel the same way. He viewed her more like a sister. This left she heartbroken, but eventually, she recognized the value of their friendship and chose to cherish it instead of dwelling on unrequited love. Meanwhile, Kirtland focused even more on his studies, which led him to excel academically and stand out among his peers. In 1997, Kirtland took a standardized school assessment test, an important exam in the U.S. used to evaluate students' reading, writing, and math skills, which is often crucial for university admissions. His score was nearly perfect, earning him the distinguished title of Presidential Scholar, an honor for the country's top students. Kirtland was dedicated to his studies, but he also believed in leading a balanced life, which led him to compete in tennis. He frequently participated in city tournaments, many hosted at local universities, highlighting his versatility and discipline. In 1998, Kirtland started a new chapter at Yale University, choosing to major in American Studies. As he adapted to campus life, he was assigned to a residential college and shared a room with a student named Michael. The two quickly became close friends. Michael was particularly impressed by Kirtland's constant kindness and selflessness. He was someone who offered help without expecting anything in return. Michael's impressions were spot on. Kirtland's calm demeanor, patience, and genuine kindness made him magnetic. He easily connected with others, not out of effort, but because it was part of his character. His fellow students at Yale quickly recognized his captivating personality, sharp intellect, and humble nature, leading them to respect and befriend him. As people got to know him better, many realized that he was a trusted confidant. Friends often turned to him for advice, and Kirtland never let them down. He showed his appreciation not through grand declarations but through thoughtful gestures. During trips to New York City, just a couple of hours away from campus, he would often return with small gifts for those he cared about. Although he and female friend no longer lived in the same city, their friendship never faded. In one of their many conversations, she asked him why he never spoke about dating women. Deep down, she believed his silence was a kind way of sparing her feelings, but she wasn't prepared for the answer Kirtland gave. In a moment of honesty, Kirtland shared a part of himself he had kept private. He simply wasn't attracted to women. He explained that he was gay. She, surprised but open-hearted, listened carefully. Although it saddened her to think that Kirtland hadn't felt safe sharing this sooner, that conversation, free of judgment and full of trust, marked a turning point. It allowed Kirtland to embrace his identity more freely. From that day forward, he confided in she about the men he was attracted to. After graduating in 2002, Kirtland pursued another dream, traveling the world. His first destination was China, where he taught English and later took part in a cultural exchange program. This experience led him to Spain, where he lived with a host family and immersed himself in a different culture. Those months abroad helped him gain clarity about his future. By 2004, Kirtland realized he wanted to become a doctor. Driven by a strong sense of purpose, he returned to Yale, this time attending its School of Medicine. He continued to excel academically, writing his medical thesis on how traditional Chinese medicine could be applied to treat HIV patients in Hong Kong. After earning his degree in 2008, Kirtland moved to Manhattan to start his emergency medicine residency. During this time, he volunteered with a team of about 40 local healthcare professionals dedicated to educating New York's LGBTQ community about the risks associated with illicit substance use and unsafe intimate relationships. Kirtland's dedication as a doctor shone through when he made an exceptional and precise diagnosis for a patient with a rare type of fish poisoning. This case was significant enough to be featured in an article in the New York Times. Outside of his medical career, Kirtland enjoyed a lively social life, attending various gatherings and events when his schedule permitted. It was during one of these social outings that he met Andre Davids. Born in 1977 and a native of New York, Andre was very close to his sister. Unlike Kirtland, who was outgoing, Andre was more introverted. At that time, Andre was undergoing medical treatment, but the details of his condition were kept private. What was known was that his treatment involved medication that could potentially interact dangerously with other substances. Despite their differing personalities, Kirtland and Andre quickly felt a strong attraction to each other. What began as a friendship soon blossomed into a romantic relationship. Even though Kirtland was open about many aspects of his life, he chose to keep his relationship with Andre private for a long time, even from his closest friends and family. By the time he completed his medical residency, he felt it was time to take a break from the pace of New York City. Longing to reconnect with his family, Kirtland returned to Arizona in July 2012. He temporarily moved in with his parents, Peggy and Danny. Grateful to be home again and the support of his loved ones, Kirtland shared his happiness on social media. Soon after, he began working at 2 hospitals in the Phoenix metropolitan area. Though miles apart, his bond with Andre remained strong. He also kept in touch with his friends in New York, often reuniting with them during visits, whether they came to Arizona or he traveled east. Eventually, Andre began accompanying him on these trips until, in 2013, he decided to move to Arizona permanently to be closer to Kirtland. That September, Kirtland posted a photo of the 2 of them together online, making their relationship public for the first time. The revelation surprised some friends, but they warmly welcomed Andre into their circle. They didn't just offer polite gestures, they genuinely tried to include him socially. However, from the outset, Andre seemed reluctant to connect. His jealousy toward Kirtland's friendships gradually became more noticeable over time. This possessiveness intensified, and he began asking Kirtland to avoid spending time with his friends. Kirtland, ever the optimist, remained calm. He didn't allow Andre's behavior to derail his own goals. He continued making plans with his friend, even organizing trips together. Rather than feel discouraged, Kirtland believed that a new environment might help their relationship. He dreamed of moving to a more open and accepting place for LGBT people, somewhere they could thrive as a couple. After giving it thoughtful consideration, California seemed like the perfect destination. He was excited by the idea and shared his vision with Andre, assuring him that they would embark on this new chapter together. Once they relocated, Kirtland began working at a hospital. Simultaneously, he looked forward to being more active in the LGBT community. California, with its vibrant culture and inclusivity, felt like the ideal place to do just that. True to his enthusiastic nature, the prospect energized him deeply. In February 2014, they rented an apartment in West Hollywood, a lively neighborhood known for its nightlife and diversity. Initially, only Andre moved in, as Kirtland had to make a trip to Japan. But upon returning to the US on March 24, Kirtland sensed immediately that the change in scenery had done little to repair what was broken. The tensions between them still lingered. For the first time, he seriously contemplated ending the relationship. On the afternoon of Saturday, March 29, 2014, after a restless night for Andre, who had used banned substances and barely slept, Kirtland decided it was finally time to have the difficult conversation they had avoided for too long. Calmly, he expressed his dissatisfaction with where things were heading and admitted that he was considering dating other people. Andre, unprepared, unwilling to accept the possibility of separation, refused outright. He also rejected any suggestion of an open relationship, insisting on exclusivity. The conversation quickly escalated into an argument as tensions flared until both men reached for kitchen knives. What began as a verbal exchange devolved into a physical struggle. Kirtland, in a moment of regained clarity, attempted to de-escalate the situation, but Andre, overtaken by rage, did not stop. In a violent outburst, he seized the weapon and stabbed Kirtland repeatedly until he collapsed, lifeless. Panicked and unsure of what to do next, Andre called his sister and told her they had a serious fight, but he withheld the horrifying truth of what had just happened. Alarmed by her brother's unstable behavior and fearing he might harm himself, Andre's sister immediately contacted the police, sharing all the information she had. Officers were dispatched to the address she provided to conduct a check. However, when no one responded at the door, they eventually left the scene. As the hours passed and she remained without news, Andre's sister called the police again. This time, officers returned to the apartment, accompanied by a team of firefighters. At 4:55 p.m. on Saturday, March 29, 2014, both teams entered an apartment in West Hollywood. Inside, they found a gruesome scene. Kirtland was on the kitchen floor after a violent attack. In the bathroom, Andre was in the tub, injured and holding a knife, threatening to take his own life. Next to him were a cell phone and a bottle of pills. A police officer quickly secured the knife, while the fire department helped lift Andre out of the tub. He was taken to a nearby hospital to treat injuries on his neck and wrists. Unfortunately, paramedics confirmed that they could do nothing for Kirtland, who was officially pronounced dead by the Los Angeles County coroner just before 7 p.m. The autopsy showed the extent of Kirtland's injuries. He had suffered 40 stab wounds from various sharp kitchen tools, was disemboweled, some organs were stuffed into the mouth, and pills were stuffed into the body cavity. From the outset, Andre Davids was identified as the main suspect. At the hospital, toxicology tests revealed multiple substances in his system. When detectives spoke with Andre in his hospital room, he did not refuse to answer their questions. Instead, he confessed to the murder and recounted the events leading up to it, expressing deep remorse and a wish to end his life. On Sunday, March 30, 2014, after further investigation, Andre was arrested at the West Hollywood Sheriff's Station. He was charged with murder involving a deadly weapon and held on a $1 million bail. He was then moved to the correctional facility in Los Angeles. News of Kirtland's murder spread quickly, dominating headlines and attracting significant media attention. Just a week later, a separate violent incident in the same apartment complex injured several people, causing widespread fear among residents. Many began to reassess their safety in the area. Andre's trial started in December 2015. He faced charges of voluntary manslaughter and second-degree murder. The distinction between these charges was crucial because California law required the prosecution to prove whether the crime involved express or implied malice, which impacted the potential sentence severity. Kirtland's family advocated for the most serious charge, which could lead to life imprisonment. In contrast, the defense argued that Andre's mental state was impaired by banned substance use and prescription medications. They pointed out that Andre had no prior history of violence and claimed that the killing occurred in a moment of intense emotional distress, a common argument for reducing charges in emotionally driven crimes. The jury considered various factors, including Kirtland's stated desire to end the relationship, which may have intensified Andre's emotional turmoil. On December 17, 2015, Andre Davids was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. His sentencing hearing took place on January 21, 2016, at the Los Angeles Superior Court. A particularly emotional moment occurred when Wayland, Massachusetts, the older brother of the victim Kirtland, addressed the court. He spoke directly to Andre, conveying his deep pain and anger over the loss of his brother in such a violent manner. He expressed a wish that the memory of the crime would torment Andre for the rest of his life. In California, involuntary manslaughter carries a sentence of 3 to 11 years. The judge decided to impose the maximum sentence of 11 years, along with an additional year for the use of a deadly weapon. Kirtland's family and many others in the community were deeply troubled by the verdict, believing the sentence to be too lenient given the brutality of the crime. Some even called for a retrial to seek a harsher punishment, but the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution prohibits a second trial for the same crime. Andre's legal team appealed the 12-year sentence, seeking a reduction. The appeal was heard on November 17, 2016, by a panel of 3 judges in California's 2nd District Court of Appeal. The defense argued for a mid-range sentence of 6 years. However, the deputy district attorney described the crime scene as one of the most horrific she had ever seen, which left the judges convinced of the crime's severity. In her closing statement, the deputy district attorney highlighted Andre's danger to society. Ultimately, the judges upheld the original sentence, agreeing that the nature of the crime warranted the maximum punishment allowed by law. The tragic death of Kirtland marked a profound loss for his family, friends, and the communities he touched. A gifted doctor and compassionate soul, Kirtland's journey from a cherished child in Scottsdale to a respected physician in West Hollywood was defined by kindness, intellect, and a commitment to helping others. His life, cut short by a violent act born of personal turmoil, left an indelible void. Andre David's conviction for voluntary manslaughter and 12-year sentence offered some measure of justice, but for many, it could not erase the pain of such a brutal crime. Jonathan Candy was a 42-year-old engineer working with the Oklahoma City basketball team. He focused on equipment maintenance and had developed his career over many years, first in sports and then in technical fields, which allowed him to support his family comfortably. In 2024, he had been married for 10 years to his wife, Lindsay Candy, who was 39. They lived in Yukon, Oklahoma, a small, quiet suburb with a population of over 20,000. They had 4 children: Dylan, 18, Ethan, 14, Lucas, 12, and their youngest child, who was just 10. The identity of the 10-year-old was kept private due to his young age and vulnerability. In the spring of 2024, this 10-year-old boy is about to experience a tragic event, an event that will greatly impact his life and those around him. The Candy family was viewed as a model American family, friendly and tight-knit. They have built a strong influence in the community, raising their children in one of the safest and most beautiful suburbs of the state. At that time, Ethan and Lucas were in school, in the 9th and 6th grades, respectively. Meanwhile, Dylan had graduated from high school in 2023 and was preparing for adulthood. He planned to attend college and had found a job to save money while applying to various schools. The Candy family did not have any mental health issues. Their upbringing was stable and uneventful. There were no instances of running away from home, and the parents maintained a peaceful household, allowing their children the freedom to make choices. This environment contributed to a thriving atmosphere at home, where the kids grew up feeling strong, sociable, and loved. They were always supportive of each other and even appeared in a local bakery advertisement, where they were regular customers and shared their favorite meals. Jonathan and Lindsay worked hard to help their children prepare for the future and lead fulfilling lives. However, behind this seemingly happy facade, a terrible situation is unfolding that will create a nightmare on Willow Street. On the evening of April 21, 2024, a Sunday, the whole family gathered at home. The older children spent time with their friends but returned home early to prepare for school the next day and to go to bed on time. Everything seemed normal for the Candy family, and no one anticipated the shocking incident that was about to occur. After dinner, Jonathan went to bed, and each child settled into their own room on the 2nd floor. Later that night, the children overheard Jonathan and Lindsay arguing in the living room on the 1st floor. Although the specifics of their argument were unclear, it escalated dangerously. Despite the tension, everyone remained calm and went to bed. The youngest boy, whose fan was running, could hardly hear the commotion below. Meanwhile, a tragedy unfolded on the first floor that resulted in the deaths of 5 family members. But what exactly happened, and who was responsible for this horrific crime? In conversations with the only surviving family member, more details emerged after the incident. The fire alarm went off, which forensic experts determined was caused by gunpowder fumes from the shooting. The noise startled the youngest child, who didn't understand what was happening or why the alarm was sounding. Curious, he left his room to investigate, completely unprepared for the horrific scene he was about to encounter. As he stepped into the hallway, he noticed that the doors to his brother's rooms were open. Ordinarily, this might have seemed odd, but he thought everyone had gotten up due to the alarm. He made his way downstairs to the first floor and noticed a light on. He called out for his parents but received no answer. He then called his brothers, but all he got was the continuous beeping of the warning. Hoping to find answers, the boy went to the living room. The first thing he saw was blood splattered on the walls and furniture. In the center of the room lay his mother and father in large pools of blood. His father was sprawled on top of his mother, having suffered a gunshot wound to the head. The boy was terrified and in shock. He rushed to his father, trying to wake him up, not fully grasping what had happened. He saw the bullet holes and felt his parents grow cold, but he refused to believe they were dead. Despite shaking his father repeatedly, there were no signs of life. His mother did not respond either. In a moment of desperation, he called out for his brothers, still unaware that he was the only survivor. Overwhelmed with grief, he cried and collapsed onto his parents' lifeless bodies. He then walked through his brother's room and saw an identical, horrifying scene. Blood was everywhere, and there were no signs of life. Eventually, he realized he needed to call for help. Summoning his courage, he reached out to a rescue worker and requested assistance. This initiated a horrifying sequence of incidents that would lead to a deeper investigation into this unimaginable tragedy. When law enforcement and paramedics arrived, they quickly realized that nothing could be done. The family had been dead for several hours, as indicated by the rigor mortis and the state of the blood on the floor. The parents and older brothers were declared dead at the scene, and the house was cordoned off for investigation. Forensic experts and detectives, horrified, began to reconstruct the scene of the brutal massacre. The idea of an outsider attacking the family was quickly dismissed, as there were no signs of forced entry or any outsiders present. This raised concerns that the murders had been committed by a family member. At some point, the 10-year-old boy was found to be covered in blood, leading police to consider whether he might have been involved. However, his behavior, condition, age, and the evidence quickly eliminated any doubt. There were no traces of gunpowder on his hands, and no fingerprints on the weapon. Forensic experts thoroughly examined the windows and doors and found no signs of staging. Everything in the house was intact, with no valuables disturbed or missing. They reviewed street surveillance footage and only saw the family members returning from the store that evening. No one else had entered or left the house before the police's arrival. The boy mentioned hearing his parents scream before he fell asleep. Since the weapon was found next to the body of Jonathan, the boy's father, it was clear that the father had committed a crime against his family before harming himself. As investigators analyzed the crime scene, it became evident how ruthless and cold-blooded 42-year-old Jonathan had been. The motive behind his actions remained unclear. The police could not determine the cause of the conflict, as no suicide notes were found in the house. They needed to analyze the mobile phones and computers of all family members, which were seized immediately, hoping to uncover new information. However, a complete analysis would take time. It remains a puzzling question why a loving father, who seems to be a good family man, would kill his wife and children but spare his youngest son. The weapon used in the crime was taken for examination, confirming that all members of Candy's family, including Jonathan, were shot with the same gun. Only Jonathan's fingerprints were found on the handle, ruling out the involvement of anyone else in the attack. Notably, none of the victims, including Lindsay, showed any signs of defensive injuries, suggesting that Jonathan's violent outburst was completely unexpected and uncontrollable, leaving no one time to react or defend themselves. Lindsay, who did not die instantly, bled on the living room floor while Jonathan, upstairs, methodically killed their sleeping children. It is believed that Lindsay heard the commotion but was powerless to intervene. Detectives considered the incident to be highly unusual. Friends and relatives found it hard to believe that a devoted father and loving husband like Jonathan could commit such an atrocity. He had no criminal record, and police had never been called to their home for domestic disturbances. Initially, investigators considered other possibilities, such as robbery or an attack by a stranger, but none of these theories added up. The family was well-liked and had no enemies, and Jonathan seemed incapable of such violence. Investigations cleared Jonathan of any doubts regarding his innocence. Officers interviewed relatives and neighbors to find potential explanations for the tragedy. Those close to the family described them as friendly and problem-free, with Jonathan being a respected community member who avoided criminal behavior. His service record was impeccable, and he was seen as calm and non-confrontational. The suddenness of the incident deeply shocked his relatives, as there had been no warning signs leading up to it. While some considered Jonathan a psychopath, they acknowledged that although disagreements between him and his wife occurred occasionally, they were rare and never involved violence. People struggled to accept his guilt, and as police statements regarding the investigation emerged, confusion set in. The community sought answers to the questions raised by the media, eagerly seeking clarity amidst the turmoil. On the day of the tragedy, Candy's family did not reach out to relatives or friends. They spent time together just once, going to the store for groceries, after which the older children left home to meet their friends. Nevertheless, they all reunited in the evening. The youngest child was unaware of any issues. It felt like a regular day. Jonathan remained calm and did not show any signs of anger. An alarming piece of information came from Michael Buru, a neighbor of the Andy family, who revealed that Jonathan had often helped him with construction and household tasks before the tragedy. They maintained a close relationship and even talked about personal matters. Michael mentioned that Jonathan once confided in him about his struggles, admitting he was dealing with depression and was taking medication prescribed by a doctor. However, Jonathan suggested that he had overcome his illness and that his depression had improved. He claimed to feel fine and had no lingering negativity toward his spouse, attributing his previous unhappiness to his mental state. After that conversation, no one heard him mention a relapse. There were no incidents indicating a return of his depressive symptoms. Investigators reviewed Jonathan's medical records but found nothing new. He had not sought help from psychiatrists or psychologists in recent times. If there had been any changes in Jonathan's condition, they would likely have been noticeable in his behavior. However, the investigation hit a dead end because no one reported anything suspicious. Some family members were aware of Jonathan's past depression, which had been resolved years ago, but they expressed no concern about his current state. Jonathan's mother mentioned that he had quickly overcome his illness and that his depression had not negatively impacted family relationships. Rather, his wife had supported him throughout. People close to Candy's family did not perceive Jonathan's struggles as serious. After overcoming his depression, he seemed to be part of a normal, happy family. The detectives found no additional leads. Was it possible that Jonathan experienced a resurgence of depression? If so, was he keeping it hidden? This was the only potential explanation for what had happened and could provide a motive. However, psychiatrists noted that it would be very difficult to hide such a condition given their active social life. Lindsay and Jonathan regularly spent time with their children, enjoying a vibrant lifestyle filled with barbecues and social gatherings. Their last barbecue event took place on Saturday, April 20th, at Michael's house, where neither Jonathan nor his wife displayed any signs of conflict. What occurred in their home did not align with the existing narrative. More information was needed, but it was lacking. There was hope that insights from mobile phones and computers could reveal important clues. There was a suspicion that jealousy might have played a role in the murder. However, even this line of investigation yielded little. The initial examination revealed no significant findings. Jonathan and his wife communicated regularly on social media, but their conversations appeared to be friendly, without any signs of intrigue or infidelity. Consequently, any theories about betrayal had to be set aside until a thorough analysis of their correspondence could be conducted. Additionally, Lindsay and Jonathan conducted routine searches online, but nothing concerning emerged. The main witness for the police in the case was a 10-year-old boy who, for unknown reasons, had been taken in by his maternal relatives. Many compassionate individuals wanted to help him deal with his trauma, leading to the creation of a fund aimed at raising $100,000 for his support. By the fall of 2024, the fund had already collected over $74,000, and donations were still pouring in. During the spring, the boy attracted attention not only from those offering emotional and financial support but also from law enforcement officers conducting investigations. The police did not speak to him immediately, recognizing that he was in shock and struggling to cope with his traumatic experience. Despite his young age, he was very aware of the horrific event that had claimed the lives of his loved ones. Initially, the boy had trouble sleeping, often waking up screaming and in tears. Multiple psychologists worked with him after he once expressed that he did not want to live. His relatives rallied around him, helping to ease the effects of his severe trauma, but he still faced many challenges ahead. Experts concluded that the boy could meet with the police to provide them with important information, so a child psychologist was brought in to ensure he felt safe and comfortable during the conversation. The psychologist collaborated with investigators to create a list of topics that would be least traumatic for the child. However, despite their efforts, what the boy shared mirrored what others familiar with his family had reported. He struggled to understand why his father had committed such a violent act. He recalled hearing his parents arguing before bedtime, but he could not comprehend the details. A fan was running in the room, drowning out the sounds of the argument, and eventually, he fell asleep, unaware of the tragedy that was unfolding. The boy also confirmed that Jonathan was never cruel or aggressive. He had never hurt his children or his wife, Lindsay. Detectives wanted to know why no one else reacted to the shooting that began inside the house. The other children must have heard their mother's screams, yet they were fast asleep and were shot during the night. It seemed as though fate was on the side of evil. Jonathan used a small-caliber pistol, which is relatively quiet, and forensic experts suggested this might explain why neighbors didn't notice anything during such a quiet time of day. However, it was puzzling that none of the children in the house woke up or heard anything until it was too late. The younger child mentioned that fans were running in every room, which might have muffled the sounds of the shots. Despite the police's efforts, they could not gather new information from the child. The detectives had to ask him some uncomfortable questions regarding the incident, the positions of the bodies, and the bloodshed. Eventually, the boy became anxious and began to cry. The child psychologist decided to halt the questioning to prevent further distress for the boy, leaving the detectives without any new leads. Relatives reported that after meeting with the police, the boy became even more anxious. Psychologists were worried about how to help him deal with this new trauma, as he had just begun to recover from his previous experiences. The police's questioning raised feelings of fear, despair, and helplessness once again. Consequently, they decided not to push him further and to avoid drawing media attention to him. Journalists, being less sensitive, made it more challenging for the boy to maintain his privacy. However, through collective efforts, they managed to secure confidentiality for him. Despite the presence of an expert during the police interview with the boy, it appeared to have a detrimental effect on him. During this time, he stayed with his aunt, who became his official guardian. It is expected that once the fund raises enough money, she will receive financial support to help her nephew address his mental health issues. He continues to suffer from frequent panic attacks, disrupted sleep, and nightmares that have not improved. His aunt believes that the funds should not only cover rehabilitation but also ensure that he can pursue an education and rebuild his life. While this support may seem like a weak consolation and cannot bring back his loved ones, he must navigate a long and challenging recovery with the help of those close to him. Investigators were able to reconstruct the events surrounding the tragedy. It began after an argument between Jonathan and Lindsay escalated, leading him to grab a weapon. He first shot his wife, Lindsay, severely injuring her. She fell to the floor, bleeding but still alive. Jonathan, still armed, was consumed by rage as he entered the children's rooms. He encountered his 18-year-old son, Dylan, and attacked him on the head without hesitation. Dylan was using earplugs, likely to avoid being disturbed by the argument. It's possible that had he not been wearing them, the outcome might have been different. The fatal shot instantly claimed Dylan's life. Jonathan then moved to Ethan's room, where he also attacked his child on the head. The same tragic fate befell his 12-year-old son, Lucas. Only the youngest son, who is 10 years old, survived. The reasons for this remain unclear. Perhaps the father felt pity for the youngest, or he miscalculated and mistakenly overlooked his room. Jonathan went downstairs and returned to the living room. It seemed he understood what had happened, so he ended his life. On April 23rd, a group made up of people who cared for the family and the surviving child came to pay their respects. 39-year-old Lindsay was remembered as a devoted mother and loving wife. As a housewife, she did everything she could to ensure her children were comfortable. 18-year-old Dylan was described as a kind young man who supported his family and was always there for his loved ones. Intelligent and strong, he was a source of support for his friends. The family and friends are heartbroken by this tremendous loss. The youngest victim, 12-year-old Lucas, was unaware that the real threat to his life came from someone close to him. Jonathan will be remembered as a good father and husband, recognized for his ability to uplift spirits and make others laugh. Many struggled to believe that he could commit such an act. Although they acknowledged the evidence against him, they speculated that he was in a state of altered consciousness or psychosis that he couldn't control. At the last press conference, the detectives reported that there can be no doubt that the killer of the Candy family was Jonathan. However, by this time, there was no other information. The only thing the forensic scientist managed to achieve was to cross out any other suspects from the list. Unfortunately, even after several months, nothing new was found out, and the exact reason for the attack remains unknown.